12 miles below by Mark Arrows. Chapter 11, The First Mile Below. You're going to have to fix this one all on your own, just like a real grown-up. Don't worry, it's easy. You just need to wake up. Wake up or die, boy. I survived the fall. Don't ask me how, because I'm not sure myself. I'd woken up half frozen to a screaming alarm and repair glue administered everywhere on my chest, which made it hard to move around. I had just finished patching up the last tear left in my suit when Father's voice crackled into my speakers. "You're awake," he said from his seat on the concrete block, after confirming I'd been moving around. He hadn't come out of this ordeal unscathed. That might be an understatement. I'd never seen the family armor this damaged. Deep gashes lined the sides of his chest and leg plates, exposing circuitry. And under that, hints of more submetal plates with dozens of glowing blue lines etched into each. They almost looked like patterns, but too much of it was covered by the wiring to make sense. "You survived the fall," I croaked out, my voice unexpectedly weak. "Yes. I am alive." "Well spotted." Rolling over, I tried to stand back up on my feet. "How long has it been?" 3 hours since the explosion." Why are you here?" He stopped tinkering with the rifle and glanced up. "What does that mean?" I hit a pole end. "Why didn't you leave me to die?" It could have been a regrettable accident that he hadn't found me. Simple way to finally get rid of the weakling. A textbook Winterscar plan. I would be derelict in my duty had I abandoned you. I honor my oath. Something you should learn from. Rich, coming from the guy that drank himself near death every day for 13 years until reality slapped him in the face. Did a lot of honoring the oath of duty back then, old man. Pain filled my legs, stabbing inside from 100 different pinpricks, but they lifted me back up onto my feet. "Where are we? Is this the underground?" "It is." The way he said that had a tinge of dread to it. "We are somewhere in the lower first level. Deep enough to protect from the climate." It was hard to sort truth from fiction with the underground. I'd heard hundreds of stories, how it was completely different layer by layer. But how do you fit a massive forest when thousands of tons of metal and rocks lay on top, for example? Or fit underground mountains? Or have rivers and plains? Or floating rocks and castles? The underground supposedly had everything and more. No hint of green around here, though. Instead, it's all industry and blocky concrete rooms, and a low ceiling above us. Are we in an undersider city? He shook his head. "Do you see anyone?" There wasn't a single person anywhere nearby. Vermin didn't populate the area either, no rats, weasels, or insects. Gods, I can't hear anything besides silence. That put me on edge. He waved his right hand over to the mess of piping snaking around. "Look around you. Pipes leading nowhere. Doorways that nobody can reach. Staircases that lead to dead ends like this one here." He pointed to the staircase that led into a wall. "Who designed this fever dream? No one lives in these parts of the underground." Father said. "The first layer is always some sort of city like this one. Architecture might change up, but it's always a city. Linked to other fake cities by tunnels and constantly changing." "Changing?" "Yes, changing. Did you forget what that meant? You just said that nobody lives here." "If you don't interrupt, I will get to that." He ground out, then shook his head. "Never mind. Find out for yourself. You claim to be a scholar, right boy? Pride yourself on that intellect of yours? Use it. Look for motion." "Fine." I ignored the jab and did as asked. The alleyway had looked like it went somewhere, but that dead-end staircase was the only way down. I could see dust on the ground, and signs of something being dragged across it, right to where I was. So he'd dragged me here. The tracks came from a courtyard up ahead, surrounded by uneven platforms, and what looked to be a fountain in the center, hundreds of pipes leading to it. Vast lines of lights attached to the ceiling and random spots flooded the area, showing any detail I cared to look at. Almost hidden by those floodlights were thousands of tiny glimmering teal gems scattered across the ground. The place was as silent as a grave. I saw nothing move save for the dust slowly drifting in the air. What am I looking for? You can find out on your own. My priority is to repair my rifle, or the next encounter will be my last," he said, not bothering to look up from his work. Sitting down, I started looking for any signs of motion as he'd suggested. It was about half a minute before I recognized what he meant. The teal gem glimmers. They were moving. Slowly, very slowly, but it was clear they weren't stationary at all. The better visibility with my head free was worth the discomfort of the current climate. The air was cold, but it wasn't an immediate danger. Taking off my mask and helmet, I got on my knees to get a closer look. Tiny, tiny little creatures were walking beneath my gaze. They were machines, I realized. And it wasn't a gem but a teal light instead. Oddly bulky, like a rectangle shaped with a triangle theme, carried by 6 miniature mechanical legs. 2 limbs remained folded at its front like the pictures of praying mantis, occasionally probing down on the ground. Carapace-like layers of metal plates and spikes decorated the body. "They're called mites," Father said, breaking my focus. "They're the reason for the unending city." Progress on his rifle had been slow considering he stubbornly refused to use his left hand, even as far as twisting his fingers oddly to manipulate 2 things at a time. Did he hurt his left arm? He clicked the last piece together, locked the bar into place and rose from his seat. Then he reached down to the boots and drew out his occult knife with his personal flourish. A small click of a switch at the sheath, and the blade's edge flared glowing blue, heat distorting the cold air around it in a small haze. He strode up and kneeled down next to me. A light stab chipped the ground, close to the mite. "Job finished," he turned off the knife and stowed it back in his boot with another reflexive flourish. Father never played around with his rifle like this, but the knife was something more personal to him. It seemed almost a reflex of his to twirl that blade whenever he drew or sheathed it. "Watch," he said, pointing at the chipped ground. "And don't ask foolish questions." The nearby mite quickly drifted towards the damage. Small legs holding its far larger body aloft, moving haphazardly in the general direction. In a few moments, those mechanical forelimbs had gotten close enough to probe the chipped surface. It continued to fuss over the damage for a moment before moving itself into a position it seemed to appreciate better. Then it lowered its body, almost as if to kiss the damage, the abdomen comically lifted up. Tiny sparks of lightning flashed from where the machine's mouth would have been, striking the damaged spot. So tiny I wouldn't have seen it unless I'd been looking for it. Fortunately, I was doing just that. With each flash of miniature lightning, parts of the ground appeared from nowhere. Something was filling in the missing parts of the stone floor. In moments, it scuttled off, job finished. Nothing of the knife's attack remained on the ground, save for the chips it had cut off. They don't care what or who causes damage, they simply live to fix it. Father said. They never stop, and they never rest. Mites build without reason. As if they have some grand design in their heads they worship. I wasn't even sure what to ask about next, knowing he'd probably reproach anything obvious. Burning with curiosity at the whole thing and no outlet for answers. The roof was almost claustrophobically low to the ground and made me feel like we were crawling around a seedier undercity. The only thing missing were the hawkers, merchants, scoundrels, and children running amok. The silence was downright eerie. We moved through the alleyway, Father clearly searching for something. He stopped every few doorways, peering inside each for only a few moments before moving on. Some of these buildings had chairs and counters, but all made of grey concrete. How are we going to make it back to the surface? I asked as we explored. They will likely leave one airship behind as a search party, he said. The rest of the expedition will have to depart 6 hours from now in order to reach Urza's orbital path and refuel. The next closest of the celestial gods within reach was Tsuya. The search party had its own deadline. How long do they have before Tsuya's orbit is out of range? Likely 2 days. Father turned to glance at me, pausing his search. If we don't reach the surface before then, they will be forced to leave and we will be stranded. Survival will not be easy. He let the gravity of the situation sink into me before he continued. We need to get close enough to contact them. They'll help us coordinate an escape within the time limit. Will it be difficult to make it out? He nodded. Difficult, yes. Impossible, no. I know the way. Follow my orders and we will live. Only relic knights could venture down here. It was clear Father had experience from previous expeditions into the underground. This wasn't a hard rule, only that anyone who explored the underground without relic armor rarely came back. Maybe it was my imagination, but there was an undertone to his voice that I hadn't heard before. What are you searching for? I suffered some damage to the armor earlier. My reserve power cell has been drained. I need to finish repairs on the armor and recharge the cell. The journey out will take hours, possibly a day. We will need every drop of power. The next building caught his attention. It seemed like he'd found something here. Instead of continuing on to the next building, we ventured further into the gloom. The only light here was the thousands of teal glimmering lights, all of them mites. Father noticed I'd been staring after those. The lights and body shape of the mites tell you what colony they're part of. He said as he examined the interior, headlight now turning on to get a better view of the dark room. The thousands of teal lights became almost unnoticeable in the harsh light. When this teal colony leaves, another will inevitably arrive. They'll tear down everything here and rebuild something new. A different city. Now that we could see detail with the headlights, it was immediately apparent that electronics and metal completely consumed the inner walls of this room. Wiring and geometric metal lined the blocks deeper into the building. Everything seemed to have been subsumed by a machine or computer of some kind. The only thing recognizable from this weird contraption was a power cell poured on the offside, on a raised pedestal. Everything else, I couldn't possibly venture a guess at. It almost looked cancerous, even. If machines could have cancer. His right hand fished through the suit's leg plates, and one side slid open, revealing a standard power cell tucked into it. This one was dead and spent, empty. That could be a charging station built by mites, if the gods favor us with luck. Could be. What does that mean? Father didn't answer, instead he unhooked the cell, then connected it to the charging station's port. Waiting now for something to happen. Mites are afflicted by madness. He said as he waited. Most things mites make are just decoration as far as we know. Replicas, half-finished constructions, or outright useless junk. I'd never seen power cells charged like this. And only now realized how much I'd taken the celestial flyovers for granted. Are these charging stations the way Undersiders power cells? Father nodded. The Undersiders don't have reliable refueling like what we have on the surface. They need to find fountains like this, or kill machines and rip their hearts out. The cells themselves are not rare down here, but repowering them is more difficult. It is the exact opposite of the surface. They'll trade with us as a last resort in times of drought. It seemed convoluted, and so much more effort than the celestial flyovers. Up on the surface, we'd simply put the power cells anywhere outside and the gods would recharge them, so long as the cells were directly under their orbit as they flew by in their satellite fortresses. Father sighed, reaching for the power cell. It looks like this fountain is also junk. Something should have happened by now. Mites seemed like blind artists, from what I'd seen. They were creating things, but almost in a dreamlike manner. And you said some of what they made is functional. He confirmed it. I could work with that. No matter how the mites built, the age-old wisdom still stood strong. Where there were wires, there would be power. If I could find the power line, I might find a functioning charging station. The charging station might be incomplete, shut off or never intended to work in the first place, but it had been similar enough to the real thing that it fooled Father into trying. I could be reasonably sure the power wires would likely look the same here. My headlights illuminated the room as I explored further behind the pedestal while he extracted his cell. It was a rat nest of wires, all connecting to metal cubes and other structures. One of the wires stood out to me. It was slightly larger and more unique than the others, with faint red markings. The difference was subtle, but I'd been an engineer all my life. This was the sort of thing I could spot. "We're wasting time. Come," Father said from the side, already walking off. I caught up behind him. "How are you searching for the charging stations?" "Instinct. The buildings that hold items within look slightly different from others. It's not a pattern I could describe in words. They're all unique, but in slightly different ways from the other buildings." We returned to the alleyway outside the room. Further down it widened out into more of a marketplace, with large pillars supporting the expanding roof. Father continued to explore certain buildings over others, each time spending a few minutes inside before venturing back out. A failure for each. Knights had at least 2 power cells on their person, one actively used by their armor and the other as reserves. Once the armor ran out of power, it would be immovable. If he'd already run through his first power cell. "How long until your current charge ends?" "Long enough," he replied over comms, spending time in the bowels of the current building he'd been exploring. "I know the armor can calculate exactly how much time until it shuts off." "It can. So how much time at this current pace?" "We'll find another charging station soon enough. One will eventually work. You don't need to worry about this." Did he think I was a child? I almost asked him again, but a tinge of fear gripped me and I decided to pick my battles. If Father didn't want to tell me, he could keep his secrets. Instead, I'd be doing my part then. Fake tents and odd buildings filled the vacant marketplace. Hundreds of wires littered the grounds and walls. It took some time to spot what I'd been looking for. A wire, leading off from somewhere deeper, up to a 2-story building further in the distance. I walked in that direction, passing by dozens of houses on the way, climbing up a staircase to reach the 2nd floor. Inside, my headlights toggled on. And shining back in the darkness was another charging fountain. I got Father's attention quickly and reported to him what I'd found. "How? You haven't spent more than an hour awake down here. There's no chance you know what to look for. If this is a joke, I will not be amused." He answered back. "How about you come here and find out then?" There wasn't a reply, but I saw him exit his current building and make his way over to where I waved. Father climbed up the stairs and peered inside the building I'd selected. Then grunted. "Don't hold your breath. The chance this works is slim." That building he'd left didn't have any power wires leaving it, and I suspect it also had an incomplete charging station within. I'm almost sure I was correct about this. None of the other buildings had this type of wire entering it. Father delved further into the room, unhooking the spent power cell. Then he inserted it into the charging port. Nothing happened. Father scoffed. "See? Now, give," and then a halo illuminated the entry port, cutting him off mid-sentence. Green glowing liquid, flecked with bright motes of gold swirling dust, surged into the cell. It filled just about 3/4 of the way before the terminal dimmed and died out. It looked like this fountain was now spent. The cell was withdrawn by Father's careful hand and inspected quietly, almost hesitantly even. "How exactly did you find this room?" he asked. "I noticed a wire I suspected was a power line, and I followed it here." Father shook his head. "The thicker wire with that red marking? That's been tried before. It hasn't proved to work any better or worse than a die toss. It looks like you drew the right roll by happenstance. You knew about the wiring. Do you think us stupid?" Or did you think the first naive solution that comes to your mind would be something every relic knight before you had somehow missed? A flush of shame passed through me. I didn't answer back, instead looking down to the ground. It's odd how obvious it was in hindsight, once pointed out like so. Tame that insufferable pride, boy. It will only get you killed down here. The refueled cell's light remained strong, the liquid shining through the small observation glass of the cell. However, I'll grant you credit for the attempt to help. We'll have to make do with this, he muttered. Finding a concrete chair, he settled down into a more comfortable position, carefully moving with each motion. Once again not moving his left arm an inch through the entire process. A wound he didn't want to aggravate? The power cell was opened up again, then tilted. Liquid poured in controlled amounts over the armor's damaged sections. I knew what was going to happen next. I'd seen him do just that dozens of times back home. It still fascinated me, a testament to the heights technology had been taken to. Once upon a time, there were people who understood how this worked. It was imperceivable at first. Just faint metallic powder, starting to stream from the furrows that lined the armor. It looked like simple dust knocked free from the armor, floating down to the earth without any other intention. However, some unnatural current of air twisted this dust cloud around, making it flow like mist just slightly above the armor. Soon covering the armor, moving with purpose from that unseen wind. The destination became clear as the many dust rivers started converging on the spilled power cell liquid. There's never been a printer found that could create relic armor. Each armor had been discovered in some way, abandoned at some point by their previous users. Either in derelicts, taken as spoils of war, or traded from the undersiders who in turn found it deep within the depths. Here was the reason these relics could survive eons, despite nobody knowing how to even print repair parts for them. This was the very soul of the armor. Chapter 12, You Don't Belong Here. The black dust cloud pooled on top of the spilled fuel. The liquid shimmered, light coming from within it. It was that golden light that the armor's spirit absorbed. The metallic swirl whisked away the glow from existence. One small droplet's worth, one after another. Condensation formed under the dust, the smallest droplets already freezing from the ambient temperature. Typical of a power cell, water was the waste material once it extracted the energy portion. Father held out bits of cut alloy scraps from his pack in offering to the cloud. The armor accepted and surrounded it, nibbling away until nothing remained in his hands except for the ceramic white shards that had been originally on the scrap. The dust would swirl around the matter it consumed, then stream back down to fuss over the damaged sections. Frayed parts grew back as it consumed the scrap. In a few minutes, the armor had repaired its leg back to working condition. It had left only frozen condensation and rejected material behind. There were many names for this spirit, but no argument that this wasn't the very soul of the armor. Each relic armor had its own. So long as parts of the soul were still active, it could rebuild an armor from even a fragment, though I've never heard of anyone insane enough to put that to the test. These were too rare to experiment on. The chance to lose an armor would be terrifying. Father withdrew the moderately spent power cell, tucking it back into the suit's leg holder as reserve. It clicked shut, pulling the room back into darkness. Our headlights were the only source left. In the new obscurity, the teal-lit mites seemed to spring up everywhere. On the ceilings, walls, and ground, now noticeable again. Do they attack people? I'd always heard that the machines from the underground attacked humans. I'd just had my first encounter with one a few minutes ago, and so far it hadn't even acknowledged my presence. Can't be sure if it's intelligent or not. Father stood back up, tossing aside the waste material and wiping off the accumulated sleet. So long as the superstructure isn't changed from whatever design is in their head, they ignore everything and everyone. Can I touch one? And it won't bite back. He seemed taken aback by that question. I suppose you could. Why would you want to? Curiosity propelled me, taking off the environmental suit's gloves, skin exposed in the open air. Chill instantly siphoned the warmth in my hand, but I could bear with it for a moment. There was no way I could pick up something that small with these thick gloves. Father looked on with what I think was puzzlement. The mite did not try to escape when my hand loomed over it. Neither did it deviate its course when I picked it up. Its legs continued to twitch and flail around, searching for the ground but otherwise not any more bothered by the lack of it. The body was still tiny, almost hard to grab. Closer inspection showed that the light they'd carried was at the front, almost where the eyes would be if this were an animal. I sat the mite down on the palm of my hand and watched. It really looked like a tiny fat hybrid of a triangle and rectangle. A metallic ant. The legs quickly gripped to my palm, and the machine crawled around, its tiny forelimbs probing my skin almost in annoyance. Maybe because of the ice-cold air that was already numbing my hand, there wasn't any bit of a sensation. Or more likely, it truly was too small and light. Soon it had reached the edge and made no move to slow down. I had to rotate my hand to prevent it from falling, but even so the mite continued to single-mindedly seek the edge no matter how I turned. What I can't understand is why you wouldn't want to see these things in more detail, Father. They're fascinating. He said nothing to that. Instead, he shook his head and continued down the empty streets, still searching for something, knocking on walls occasionally. You said they break down other mites' works. What happens when two living colonies are in the same area? Father grunted, they don't fight. They deconstruct the other's buildings while building their own, from what I've heard. They don't care where the damage comes from, even if it's from other mites. They'll simply try to fix it. Whatever form that looks like. I could see what he meant, my mite hadn't stopped trying to throw itself off my hand from the very moment I'd picked it up. They truly had one-track minds. Is it even possible to walk through a section that's trapped between two colonies? Mites build randomly, but there's always a path forward that's accessible by foot. They seem to follow that rule above all others. When two colonies fight for ground, they seem to agree on a mutual main path. I let the mite walk off my hand. It tumbled down onto the ground, coming to a stop on its back. Its legs continued to seek the ground without success. Other mites stopped and made their way to their fallen brother. In moments, their forelimbs helped lift and rotate the distressed mite back onto the ground proper. So, they could at least speak to one another and had some sense of teamwork. If I brought back a mite to the surface, what would happen? It would return to its colony. You don't know. I don't see any reason to study these. They can't be tamed. A mite speaker might know better. Father stopped in his tracks, then groaned deeply, his right hand palming his head as if he'd made a mistake. They're undersiders who claim to communicate with the mites. Mite speaker. It's in the name. Claim to. Nobody knows anything about the mites or what built them. All I'm certain of, is that the underground looks the way it does because of them. Anyone who tells you they know more is double-dealing and trying to fleece you of something. You're a Winterscar, spotting this should be intuitive. Now that their fellow mite brother had been rescued from its orientation issues, the mites left with disinterest, searching for anything that did not fit the blueprint they'd designed. My gloves neatly slipped back on my hands as I followed behind. This place felt like a city, but only in how a painter would draw a city from memory. There were missing structures and city planning that just weren't present. More like a lucid dream, a simulation of a city. Will the colony always make this exact city? I could tell I was treading some dangerous ground here with Father. All these questions weren't something he enjoyed hearing from me. To him it was all scholar scrap shit, and I was sounding more and more like a reacher cast by the minute. But this wasn't information I'd be able to guess on my own, and as far as I understood his methods and rules, he'd only get angry at things I could have figured out. I don't know if they create the same city over and over. Again, those are questions for the undersiders who live down here. And you've never asked them. Most of the undersiders all stay within the safety of the cities, they could go their entire life without seeing a mite. Chances are, they wouldn't know. And as surface dwellers, we're unwelcome in their cities. We're seen as surface scum, desperate thieves at best. A deserved reputation at worst. Now end it with all these questions. We're not safe or out of the snow yet. Underscore 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 un. We continued exploring blindly for the next hour while I processed all I'd learned so far. Occasionally we'd take breaks to eat rations and drink. We never stopped for long, and he always remained tense. As if expecting the worst to happen. In the clan, everyone loved to gossip about how danger-filled the underground was, making it seem inhospitable to anyone who didn't have relic armor. The first time any of this became reality to me was when Father stopped in his tracks and forced us to hide inside a room several streets away from where he'd noticed the danger. There, we stood in the dark, headlights turned off. Comms off. Quiet. He signaled with his hand. Acknowledged. I signaled back. Status? Enemy. Possible. Nearby. He moved his hand quietly, shaping each so that they were clear in the gloom. I heard nothing nearby, the city was as quiet as it had always been for the past few hours. Something had seriously spooked Father, however. Machine? Yes. He answered. Draw weapons. I nodded and slowly took out my scavenger pistol, safety clicking off, muffled under my thick gloves. He brought out his own rifle and aimed with one hand out through the doorway. For 20 minutes we stood still, ready for action. It was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Father's weapon dropped back down from its ready position and he stood up, breaking the silence. They've moved past us. How did you spot them? I had seen nothing nor heard anything. It seemed like he'd just randomly decided to hunker down. Father stood back up, grabbing my own outstretched arm and pulling me to my feet. I didn't spot them, but the signs were there. Machines are predictable. I had a suspicion we'd walked into a patrol path of theirs. Had we? Outside, the world looked the same as we'd left it, but Father still nodded. I had the armor amplify sound. Heard them pass by a few streets away from here. We're behind their patrol right now. Need to make ourselves scarce, and soon. That's exactly what we did, picking a path completely perpendicular to where we'd had our close call. I hadn't heard or seen anything, but this pattern of stopping to hide repeated 3 times over. Each time, Father would notice some evidence of machine patrol and have us hide in a room or building, waiting until they passed by. He'd point out how certain sections of the city had more debris than others, signs of machines lumbering by and damaging the roads. The mites would fix the holes, but the bits that were kicked off would remain, cluttering the place slightly more. The longest it took was a half hour. Each time, I never saw a hint of the enemy. That didn't make any of it any less tense. Here was something that genuinely worried Father of all people. Whenever the underground felt out of reach, the clan would complain about how it wasn't worth the price to live down there. How dangers like this were too much to pay for the benefits of living free from the climate. But any time a glimmer of hope came up, like a house announcing they'd recovered a new relic armor, everyone would be suddenly filled with stories of how wonderful it would be to finally travel back down to where we all deserved to live. Finding some meadow, forest, or even a metal fortress. Anything was better than the cold. There was so much more to the underground than I had ever known. And Father clearly knew about it the whole time. Why didn't you tell me of this? I asked him, while we hiked through this stillborn city. You never asked. Oh great, semantics. Don't you think it's important? Why would it be important? It's the underground. Of course it'll be important, I said. All of civilization lives down here, and eventually the clan will migrate here too. Father stopped and turned, faceless helmet holding my gaze. When? This felt like a trap. Like another one of his lessons. But it was the ultimate goal of all the surface clans, to gather enough relic armors such that we could claim and hold land against the machines on a lower level. Compared to the other surface clans, we're well on our way so far. I diplomatically answered. He shook his head slowly. No. Not in our lifetime, or your children's lifetime. Lord Atius will see that day, but none of us will. What? Why? Numbers. Even the smallest city has at least 100 armors. We've barely collected over 50, and they say the clan is a little over 300 years old. Even the poorest undersider lives like a king compared to us. He continued down, periodically knocking on the walls as he went. 100 relic armors? For a small city? Something was off about this, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It felt like he wasn't telling the full truth, but the right question slipped through my mind like sand. We turned the corner and ran into another dead end. Instead of backtracking, Father tapped on the wall here as well. It sounded hollow. If I had told you about the underground, you'd eventually wind up finding a way in through some chasm while seeking it out. He took a few steps back in my direction. I'm not blind to your curiosity, boy. There are pathways and tunnels everywhere leading down into the underground, all of them miles away from safety. You'd die within the hour from the first encounter with the automaton. Before I could press him for more answers, he crouched into a runner's stance and then exploded into a dead sprint forward. The wall ahead stood absolutely no chance. It crumbled into pieces as he tackled through it. What are you doing? I shouted. Where the mites had been wandering mindlessly, now they moved to the wall with purpose, swarming towards it. Already the nearest had begun the tiny repairs. Father's voice echoed past the ruined walls. I'm searching for a way out. Get in before the mites seal the way. They work quicker than you might suspect. I wasn't sure if this was such a great idea, but it was clear the mites would not attack us as he'd said before. They'd already grouped on the edge of the broken wall, their numbers making it look like a glowing teal line. If I hadn't seen them up close, I could have easily confused it with the occult. They seemed to have a monopoly on glowing lines. Peering past the wall, all I saw was just another empty building interior. A countertop lined the side of the room. It vaguely resembled a barkeeper's shop. I turned on my own headlights for additional illumination. Father's form stood back up in the pulverized concrete dust, figure obscured by the light beams lighting the particles. I sulked in my head and considered what he'd said before, that withholding information from me was for my safety. It didn't escape notice that I'd done the same to Kedra for similar reasons. Choosing not to tell her what the house had been doing to encourage Father's addiction. Turning his words around in my head, I hunted for a counterpoint. And failed to find any. Father's reasoning was sound. I'd just assumed it wasn't from the start, searching instead for a way to validate my initial feelings. Which hadn't been based on any logic now that I examined that thought in isolation. A rat shit. That was a textbook sign of self-deception. Tame that insufferable pride, boy. It will only get you killed down here. I'd become more impulsive on this expedition. Too single-minded on my goal for that missing tech, looking for it in places I should have known had little to no chance for a discovery. Taking risks that even my status as part of the nobility wouldn't protect me from, if they'd ever found out about it. It burned to admit, but Father was correct on this point. If he'd told me more about the underground, I would have almost certainly found myself slipping through those cracks, thinking I could survive down here. Convincing myself into a stupid death. Keith, the three gods left the world to protect us. They struggle and suffer each day against the oblivion beyond earth. What do you think would happen if the gods left their post in the heavens? If they rested instead of upholding their duty? It was just like him to pull up faith when he wanted to explain something more complicated. All right, I'll play his game. The three gods, circling the world. Urs, Suya, and Talon. Floating in orbit around the world, deep in the heart of their flying fortresses. Each protecting the world with one hand to the darkness of space, and the other stretched out to their people. To recharge our power cells when they flew above. Those power cells fueled our heaters, ships, environmental suits, everything really. I thought about the gods simply not being up there. No more celestial flyovers. No way to recharge power cells. We'd all be dead within the week. The gods did not choose lightly, Keith. They are not returning, not now, not ever. They knew the cost of leaving and they paid that price. 100-fold. The surface is not where they belong anymore, and the underground is not where you belong either. I got the message. This place wants us dead. Father took my silence for what it was and continued further into the gloomy room. Come. This should hold our target. Inside, the walls once more became less concrete and more metal and electronics. At the center of this room wasn't a fountain, but a pillar of metal with a screen and keyboard oddly held by metal arms at the side. What's that? I asked, pointing. Father walked up to it, hand reaching out. With any luck, our guide. Chapter 13, A Test of Might and Might. He examined the might creation, tapping the sides and buttons experimentally with his hand. Activate. Nothing happened. Start. Wake up. Download. On he went, going through a generic list of trigger words, frustration leaking out with each failed attempt. The keyboard did nothing, and the screen had no buttons to press. The terminal remained unconvinced throughout the interrogation. No signs of power. Father didn't seem to mind as I sat down and inspected the weird object myself. Maybe it had an on-off switch somewhere on a panel? This was assuming the mites had even built one. I saw nothing that looked like switches or buttons, besides that keyboard. Instead, only wires and geometric statues that looked like decorations at the base. They led out of the terminal, moving off further into the city. Is this terminal junk? I asked. That's uncertain. I won't be able to tell if this is functional, or junk, until I've exhausted all the possible ways to turn it on. I saw the conundrum. It's not always obvious when something couldn't work. These mites, what strange little buggers they were. They seemed to build in all kinds of quality, from artistic to functional. And I think I'd seen this kind of behavior before. A theory bubbled up in my mind. Something that I fortunately could test. If I was right about this, it could at least let us know if this terminal was worth spending time on or not. Is it safe to explore around? Father grunted in reply. We're far from the last patrol path, but stay nearby. Close enough that you can get to me in a few seconds. What are you planning? I'm getting myself a pet mite. That left him quite confused. Once I was outside the room, I made my way across the alleyway to another building. Here, there were just concrete walls and an empty windowsill. The room was desolate except for one thing, teal lights all over the walls. Taking off my gloves for dexterity, I snatched one of those mites up. It reacted like the previous mites had, trying to walk off my hand. Each time I turned direction, the mite would also unerringly change its own, almost like a handheld compass. I headed back to the dead terminal with my captive in tow, watching how it reacted the whole way. My conclusion on this micro-test: the mite had a location in mind where it belonged, and it would keep trying to get there. What are you planning, boy? Father didn't seem amused by my antics as he watched me toy around with the mite in hand. Science. Mind if I use your knife real quick? No guarantees, but there might be a way to figure out if the terminal's functional or not without spending too much time. I want to gather proof to confirm it for myself first. He stared for a moment, then kneeled down to bring out the knife with his usual flourish. He presented it hilt first to me. You're oddly cooperative, I noted. So long as your experiment is quick, he replied. On the off chance your hunch is correct, I'd be a fool to have blocked your path. His helmet took a quick scan around the room, contemplating. Mites often like to hide things, or play tricks of that nature. These terminals aren't easy to find, I need to be absolutely sure it's unworkable rather than a power source being hidden here. You have until I'm finished. Talon be with us, boy. I grabbed the knife from his extended hand. Father nodded and turned back to the terminal, searching for hidden compartments, occasionally muttering things into his helmet. Occult weapons are oddly light, even though density-wise they really had no business being this weight. Not quite light as a feather, but light enough. A small switch at the side of the hilt let me turn the weapon on. It flared to life in hand. Now, for my next hat trick. I kneeled down to test my next theory, excitement burning about the possibilities. I let go of the mite in hand at the terminal's base panel, right by what looked like an abstract statue. I savagely stabbed that decoration immediately after. Okay, maybe not savagely. But enough that someone's granddad would have yelled at me for it. Mite built metal or not, the occult weapon carved into it without issue. The damage this thing could do was several leagues above vandalism. And the mites reacted accordingly. Instantly, every single teal light in the room marched as one to go handle the damage. All except for a single rebel teal light, the mite I'd pilfered. Despite the proximity, it simply ignored the problem and walked back to the empty room I'd spirited him away from. I followed the little rebel, then stabbed the concrete ground lightly right in front of it. This time, the lazy mite went to help fix the city substructure with its fellows. Once done, it promptly continued on its single-minded war path home. There had indeed been something I'd recognized in the mites, more of a behavior really. If I considered the mites more like human tinkerers, I could map a sort of culture in my mind. The mites are craftsmen, I said. They're what? Father asked, not quite understanding what I meant. The mites might not be one super hive mind. They look more divided into subgroups, and each of those groups has land staked out to do what they want in it. Some mites might have been more motivated to create, and others might just be doing the bare minimum to get by. And some others, like the mite I'd pilfered from the empty room, hadn't worked on anything at all. They all pitched in to fix the superstructure, the city itself, but individual creations were up to the subgroups that squatted in those parts. Bizarre theory. And you learned that from playing around with a mite? What's your proof? I pointed at the renegade, who'd been happily walking against the flow of traffic. That one. I swiped it from another room. A room where nothing was built inside besides the city superstructure. See how it's not helping? This isn't the room it's assigned to. Father nodded, shrugged, then turned his attention back to the terminal. The mites are not human. Don't forget to factor that in as well. Was I personifying these machines too much? They might think and feel in ways humans absolutely couldn't, and I was only seeing the surface of it all. There were bigger things to care about down here. The mites might have ranked too low for the relic knights traversing down here. Those mite speakers might have already discovered all this, but Father clearly hadn't talked to one, since this was all news to him. There's one more test I need to do. How much time do we have? Half an hour, not a moment more. That's all the time we can spare. That's all the time I gave myself to find the power source. Each hour increases the chance machines find us. Their patrols can change, or I could miss the signs. It's only a matter of time until that happens. Can you carry me to speed me up then? Environmental suits were absolutely not designed for running around or sprinting in mind. It'll be a bit hard to work around his arm problem, but the family armor should be able to carry me easily with one hand. He'd done it before, and he'd caught up to a moving airspeeder while ferrying both me and my sister. I was smaller back then, but my sister hadn't grown that much taller since. No, he said flatly. If the armor runs out of energy, we're dead. We need to ration what we have. Marshal your strength. Half an hour, then we continue forward and you won't slow us down for experiments next time. Do we have a deal, boy? Fine. And if it does work, you'll trust me for that next time then. Fair. Don't make terms with me. I'm already giving you the benefit of the doubt. But he didn't make a move to stop me, instead he turned back to the terminal to continue messing with the controls. It was going to be a struggle to run, but I had food and drink to recoup that energy. Power cells were the bottleneck resources right now. Couldn't be helped. I grit my teeth and bolted out into the alleyway now that I was on the clock, looking for rooms with structures inside them. It didn't take long to find what I'd been looking for, thankfully, the last piece of the puzzle for my tests. Its screen was halfway completed. Metal plating was missing, or forgotten about. Its circuit boards didn't have correct endings, nor were they even connected to the hole. I had no idea what this structure was supposed to mimic, but it was clearly defective. Into the room I went. Father's knife hummed again in my hands as I sliced off a piece of the MITech, specifically a circuit board from the wall. And then I watched as this room's mites went to fix the board. It took them 3 minutes. During that time, the resulting board looked similar to the one I had cut. Similar, but not exact. There were additions in odd places and outright missing parts. There were far fewer ways to create something that works compared to a near infinite amount of ways to make something that doesn't. No need to guess this wasn't a working piece. I raced back to the terminal. The mites were already finishing up their touches to the sliced statue. Hilt first, I returned Father's knife to his hand. Look at how the sliced off piece is an exact replica of the piece they're rebuilding. I picked up the sliced off identical decoration, but quickly dropped it right back. Metal is cold. I got busy putting my gloves back on. I'm almost positive it'll work, it's simply not powered on. What are the chances that the power source is inside the room? Moderate, he said. But I suspect the wires are where the power would come from. It's only unknown how far away the source is. We could travel a half an hour or more before reaching it. Father stared at the terminal with contemplation. They could also simply end nowhere at any time. In my mind, I said, any engineer proud of his work wouldn't leave it with no way to turn on. I don't know if the mites would think like that, but my hunch says they wouldn't have made something like this in a spot of land where power wasn't accessible. The wires are for something. We should track them. Father nodded at that, and shrugged. That seems in character with the city's possible rules. You're on a time limit, are you sure you want to follow these wires? I thought for a moment, then nodded. I was sure. Father stood without another word, and began a quick march outside. I trailed behind, both nervous and hopeful. Underscore 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 un. We passed by plenty of mite structures along the path. Some of it was just blocks with flashing lights. Others were multiple screens, all rotated at different angles and all of them black and unpowered. But the wires were all there. They just weren't always connected, except for ours, which was systematically unbroken. Each minute, my confidence grew. It had to lead somewhere. We left the building entirely, following the wires across the alleyway in a quick jog. They looped and traveled wildly around the path, grouping together and splitting apart at different times. Eventually, over the course of 10 minutes, it led us to a massive building. This had been filled with hundreds of wires, entering the site from all directions. All of it converged indoors on a massive switchboard filled with lights. A podium near the center had all sorts of buttons, levers and valves that surrounded the small space. It was quite obvious that the switchboard was connected in some way to all those controls. Have you seen this before? I asked Father, hesitantly. He nodded. Mites leave puzzles like this occasionally. A team I was on a few years ago ran into a building like this one. Those switches control the lights. He pointed, then casually flipped a switch by the podium controls. A few lights blinked on while others turned off. Our theory was that this controlled power in a block of the city, but the mites had built it in such a way to be difficult, if not impossible, to turn something on intentionally. It ended up being a waste of time, unfortunately. I quickly saw what he meant. Each press of a button and pull of a lever showed predictable pattern changes in lights, just like a puzzle. Some switches would only change a few lights, and other switches would change dozens at the same time. That's all well and good, but this had at least 30 possible controls. Do you know what I'm supposed to do with all this? I waved at the switchboard. Father shook his head. We spent only a few minutes before deciding it wasn't worth investigating further. How much time do I have? 12 minutes remaining. No surprise, the relic armor probably had a timer counting down on the heads-up display inside his helmet. I decided I was going to make all the lights turn on to start with. The patterns melded into my thoughts, and with each button press I could see how the whole would work. It took a few minutes to categorize all the commands possible, but there was a pattern to this as well. And a few tricks. A good number of these controls had duplicate effects once you lined it up in your head, even if the controls looked physically different. I felt at home with this little brain teaser. I'd always been good with numbers. My mind flicked through the permutations until I'd found a path to light them all up. After a minute of rapid switch turning, a wrench in the works hit. Turning on too many lights would cause the entire board to switch off. That lasted a few seconds before the switchboard would turn on again, and reset back to its original configuration. The mites showed no change in their behavior, they really didn't care about anything besides fixing what was broken. Father, on the other hand, looked almost nervous, as if he'd seen something he hadn't expected. Were you clicking things at random? No, there's a pattern to it, like you said. I can see how I can get the results I want. There's no way you could have learned how to do that this fast. He shot back. But there was uncertainty in his voice. Fine then, pause the timer and pick out any light. I'll have it turned on in 30 seconds. 30 seconds only, and this one. He rose to my challenge, pointing out a small light in a line near the end of the switchboard. I calculated in my head, saw the path forward and pressed 5 switches rapidly one after the other. On the final switch flick, the light he'd pointed at lit up brightly. I felt a surge of pride at that. That had to be luck. Want to try another? I could do this all day. The helmet obviously obscured any expression from him, but his silence told me everything. No, I stand by my word. Continue. I played with the puzzle again, this time looking beyond the switchboard to see the actions each flip and twist would cause. It was all well and good to turn on lights, but I had to know what those lights meant. The obvious conclusion made me almost groan at the wasted time. Wires leading off also had lights built in. When the switches were pulled, some of these wires would have their lights also turned on. And one of these wires would lead back to the terminal, which I was willing to bet, had no light switched on. The problem with all this, there were hundreds of wires. I'd forgotten which one was my terminal wire. Rat shit. We're going to need to go back to the terminal. I sighed, pointing out what I'd found out about the wires to him. It had taken us 10 minutes to get here in the first place. By the time we arrived back at the terminal, that half-hour of experimentation time would be gone. Father reached out and grabbed my shoulder. I thought I'd done something off, until he patted my shoulder, awkwardly. I'll end the timer. I nodded back, unsure how to answer. Was he saying that he believed I had a working solution? Father turned and continued to walk, and I followed behind. We didn't say anything to each other, but a warm feeling was left in my stomach. Halfway through our return, he came to an abrupt stop. Danger was signaled out, along with a stop all motion order. His helmet scanned around, looking in different directions, as if trying to hear or spot something through the alleyways. There was only silence as far as I could tell. He burst into action a second later, picking me straight up without a word of warning and bolting away. A wailing scream sounded in the city, shrill and chilling. It was joined by others, almost like wolves who'd found prey. Feelings of panic deep inside started stirring. "Wait, what's that?" "Slavers," I half whispered, trying to keep as quiet as I could over the comms. "Does that sound anything like a human to you?" Father hissed back. "Machines. I'd always thought they would be silent killers, mechanical and precise. Without emotion. In my imagination, they'd swarm without a sound, only grim intent following a program of some sort. Reality was clearly different. The machines sounded outright primal, more feral than even animals could be. They howled and screamed, the voices coming closer despite Father's speed. We couldn't see them yet, but it was clear they were closing in. In minutes, we had made our way through the alleyways. He let go of me, shouting to keep running on my own into the clearing up ahead. Father reached into his belt with his free hand and dropped one of his 2 grenades on the floor mid-run. He didn't bother to align it more in the center of the pathway. It bounced after him, rolling to a stop as we sprinted far past it. It hadn't been primed, instead left alone and inert in the hallway. Father spoke out over the screeches, easily catching up behind me. "They're called screamers. Close-range rank and file that bank on shock and awe. They'll cut you to pieces if they get in range. Can we outrun them?" My short breath was already an answer to that. Even sprinting for a few moments had already winded me. The environmental suit and gear I carried was too heavy for this kind of effort. They've already pinged us. Running was never an option. We'll need to fight, win quickly, and run before more come. We stopped at the center of the clearing. This was where Father decided we'd make our stand. The corridor we'd just come from would funnel the enemy, and the plaza would give him room to fight. As good as it gets to tilt the odds. "Make sure your gun is loaded," he said, speaking fast. "Find a building to hide in and let me handle this. My armor can take hits, your environmental suit can't." He turned to stare at me and grasped my shoulder with his hand again. "Keith, listen to me closely. They will kill you if they get the chance. Don't expose yourself. Don't be stupid. And don't try any heroics. Are we clear?" I nodded, and that was all the confirmation he needed. He made his way to the best position he could find in the clearing. The wall sides of the alleyway. There, he drew out his rifle, and held it as steady as he could with a single working arm, using the edge of the wall as a makeshift grip. If there was any time to use his other hand, even if he aggravated the wound, it would be now. Still, that arm remained limp at his side. I could hear more screeching down the alley as I made my own way to cover. They overlapped one another, bloodthirst filled each terrifying howl. Fear gnawed at my stomach. I tried to stamp it out with logic. Father had his relic armor, machines were no match for him from what I'd heard. It took many working together to take down a relic wearer. That sounded too good to be true all of a sudden. The clan gossip could have easily embellished the truth to make us all feel better. "No. We'll be fine. Everything will work out." I desperately wanted to believe that. The mass of screams closing in promised a different faith. Chapter 14, The Face of Death. They came into view, trailing right behind where we'd come from. I counted 7 of them, racing towards us. From this distance they seemed small. But I recognized just how tall the alleyway had been when we'd run through it, and their heads cleared windowsills I couldn't have grabbed with my hand. They were nightmares made manifest. Elongated legs and arms far too thin and long to be human proportions, but just close enough to be uncanny. White plates of armor lined their bodies, their hands ended in claws with rust or dried blood. Exposed pseudo-rib cages, stark white, covering black wiring mimicking where innards should have been, if the creatures had been alive. All of it juxtaposed to the bone-white carapace-like armor. They must have been 7 or 8 feet tall, while hunched over. The faces were the worst part. Like human skulls, with far too many teeth, and no jaw. Deep glowing violet eyes that seemed tiny compared to the larger eye sockets, the violet motif also outlining the skeletal frame. Their spines jutted out, blade-like. And they ran at us like starving predators that had finally spotted food. Hunched over, occasionally using their arms as legs in those loping strides. There was hardly any rhythm to their motions, they simply propelled themselves forward however they could. Father braced the rifle against his shoulder. Nothing but the wall edge gripped the gun's stock, his left hand still hanging limply at his side. Even a broken arm could be moved in emergency situations. Did he think he could avoid using that arm for the entire fight? Or was he truly physically incapable of moving it? He watched as the enemy descended towards us, no flicker of movement in his form. Waiting for the moment the enemy would be in effective range. He didn't need to wait long given their speed. Tsuya, guide me to victory. He prayed under his breath, then pulled the trigger. A 3-round burst of bullets rocketed out from the rifle, striking directly into the first rushing automaton, ripping its head backwards and shattering pieces across the floor. The body collapsed on the ground, sliding to a stop across the concrete, lights winking out instantly. He shifted focus to the dropped grenade next, just as the feral group ran across. A single bullet flew true, and the world shook with fire. The explosion tore up 2 more automatons, but the rest surged through the dying flames without pause. It looks like they'd been spared the worst of the makeshift mine. Father refocused on the next closest automaton and fired another round of bullets. It tried to dodge, but he tracked the movements and matched the direction with 3 more bursts of rifle shots. It wasn't a perfect takedown. Still, the creature stumbled downwards, arms failing to hold its weight as the skull-like head cracked hard onto the ground. The violet lights flickered across the monster, struggling to remain active. The creature blessedly couldn't get back up. The next target gracefully dodged the hail of bullets sent its way, moving in a pattern that maximized Father's broken arm. The relic armor compensated for recoil. His bursts were short and contained, but only so much could be done with one hand and the corner of a wall to work with. The machines might not have respect for the fallen, but they clearly hadn't been blind either and had already analyzed how to avoid the gunfire. Father's gun clicked empty a moment later. He hadn't downed his 3rd target. 4 down, 3 still left to go. He tossed the rifle and ammunition pouches in my direction. Reload this, now. He barked out, then kneeled and pulled out the boot knife with his customary panache. The blade spun around in his palm, lit by a halo of blue as the weapon ignited mid-flourish. Father assumed the best stance he could muster, trying to balance the limp arm, taking a few steps back into the open to maximize mobility. The rifle skidded to a halt nearby, and I scrambled out to grab it. Despite the losses they'd taken, the machines continued their charge without hesitation. The first automaton barreled into knife range. This close, I could see how massive they were as they overshadowed us. Almost 3 heads taller even while hunched, they must tower over humans if they bothered to stand straight. Those arms were far longer than I had thought possible. The opening attack was a bloodthirsty grab for his throat, but he'd clearly been prepared. With a quick duck and a head tilt to the right, he narrowly avoided the grasping hands by what looked to be sheer luck. Sparks flew as the metal claws scraped past his helmet. He lunged forward in the same instant, knife seeking the automaton's throat now that he'd made it past the arms. The creature hadn't failed to notice and replicated Father's own movement, tilting its own head to the side to avoid the knife. Given the lanky arms, that might have been the best thing it could have done. It wasn't quick enough to completely escape, the knife cut through parts of the wiring exposed under where the jaw should have been. The automaton jerked and twitched in response but didn't collapse. Knife still in hand, Father spun the dagger on his palm into an undergrip, and stabbed backwards with a roar. It sunk into the back of the automaton's head down to the hilt, where Father's weight and power shoved the towering monster into the ground. He let go of the hilt, making use of his freed-up hand to pull out the last grenade on his belt. It flew directly at the racing enemies, an expert toss. No blinking lights. He hadn't primed the explosion. The two targets instantly aborted their charge and leapt to the sides, recognizing the incoming device without realizing it was harmless. With the free time, Father extracted his knife with a jerk, standing up on top of his victim's dying throes. The last two automatons twitched as they took stock of the situation, chittering to each other, realizing the deception he'd used had killed their charge. Father raised his knife in wordless challenge. They stopped chittering and hissed, moving further apart, aiming to surround their single opponent next. They still didn't get close to the grenade, keeping it far away. Looks like they weren't going to take chances with that. I ducked my attention back to the rifle, frantically trying to hit the release switch. They built the weapon for relic users, compact and made for armored hands with far more dexterity than my clumsy gloves could manage. The fat fur that protected me well against the cold was actively stopping me from telling if I'd hit the small snag or not. Panic and frustration bloomed inside me, further slowing down my progress. The automatons glanced at each other, contemplating, while Father took a step over the dead thing at his feet. Using the body as leverage for a high ground. As one, the machines turned and focused their sight on the body. Their violet eyes strobed, a signal being sent. The corpse Father stood on exploded. The blast knocked him up, but his armor could handle that sort of weak indirect damage. The real danger was the loss of position and stance. As soon as their ploy succeeded, the two automatons surged forward together, each trying to maximize their momentary advantage. It worked. The long reach of the automatons lashed out, unerring, as Father landed hard on the ground. He only had enough time to recover his footing, dodging a swipe of a claw, but was then struck backwards by the other strikes. The relic armor's shields flared to life with a blaze of blue light, absorbing the blows. He scrambled out of the way, backpedaling on the defensive. One of the automaton's claws gripped his ankle, tripping him on his back. He yanked his leg forward, the relic armor strong enough to overcome the automaton's pull. The knife flashed in his hand, neatly cutting the invader's wrist. Immediately he rolled on the floor to the side, avoiding the follow-up attacks before lunging blindly up with the knife. The automatons backed off, avoiding the obvious hit. It didn't buy him enough time to fully recover as they leaped back moments later. Relentless strikes flew at him, unyielding. Forced onto the defensive, he twisted, blocked and stumbled through the onslaught, each time surviving with slimmer and slimmer margins. His armor took the brunt of the damage. Blue shield flaring over fatal hits but conserving itself during non-critical strikes. The armor let through. The machine assault racked and gouged lines into the family armor. In desperation, Father managed a few hits in the frantic melee, slicing off fingers or tearing out parts of the machine arm plates. The fight reached a tense stalemate, the machines unable to batter past his one-handed defense, yet never losing an inch of ground. They could have continued to fight him into exhaustion until they spotted a better way. Switching tactics, the machines began focusing their strikes, corralling him towards the nearest wall and abusing the lack of defense from the left arm they'd clearly noticed. I hadn't been idle, but neither had I been efficient. The empty magazine had finally been released from the rifle, but a bullet had gotten free and lodged into the system, when I'd incorrectly loaded a fresh clip. I frantically tried to reach into the mechanism with these fat gloves, wedging fingers into the magazine chamber to knock the bullet out. That only jammed the loose metal further into the rifle, the gloves too thick to get a grip. Despair sank in my stomach like lead. My rush and inability to think through stress was costing me. Almost like an afterthought, and far too late to help me anymore, was the realization that I could have taken off my God's damned gloves in the first place. The environment down here was only cold, this wasn't the surface. Years of being a scavenger had made working with gloves almost unnoticeable, and now those reflexes had betrayed me. Still, I ripped my right glove off and tried to fish out the stuck bullet with newfound dexterity. There might be hope. Father had finally been forced up against a wall and the automatons sensed their moment had come, one of them getting too impatient and diving in for the kill. It had made one fatal mistake in its own haste. The attack had been the same one the first automaton had opened with, a lunge for the throat. With reflexes forged in war, Father moved. He ducked to the side, tilting his head and using the helmet to deflect the claw with perfect precision, the same steps as before, every action a work of art. A flash of recognition caused the automaton to abort its attack, clearly aware of the technique that had ended its sibling. This time it leaped backwards in an attempt to avoid the following knife slice to its jugular. The gambit worked. Father's knife scythed through empty air, a clear miss. But now he had room to move. He followed through on the momentum, twirling on himself and transferring the energy of a full rotation directly into his knife. It flew fast from his hand and viciously caught the automaton midair, sinking slightly under the right eye down to the hilt. The machine jerked as the impact carried through, then collapsed as it landed, limp. All the lights died out on its shell a breath later. 6 down. One single machine left to go. The last automaton struck out, scything through the air but missing as Father leapt to the side, rolling on the ground. He launched himself at it the instant his feet were firm, barreling hard into the creature's chassis with a heavy crunch, using his limp shoulder almost like a battering ram. The creature skidded backwards, gouging the ground with its feet. It held, coming to a stop. That was just the distraction. Father threw out an uppercut with his right hand, directly at the thing's missing jaw. Sparks lit up the relic armor's gauntlet as the blue shield flared to life to protect his fingers. The machine's head reeled up, cracks forming in the ceramic material of its skull. It hadn't been enough to take it out of the fight. Father drew back his hand and drove it through the ribcage, searching for something. The creature attacked simultaneously with a haymaker punch. Father's left arm twitched at the shoulder, a reflexive attempt to block the attack running through. The shoulder lifted slightly up. The hand and arm guard remained completely limp, leaving his head completely exposed. The relic armor's shield flared to life once more, but broke before the skeletal fist. The blow carried into his helmet, cracking his neck sideways and launching him into the air. With a sickening crunch, he crashed to the ground and slid to a stop seconds later. His body twitched horribly, the right hand extended up in a lingering fencing reflex. A few horrifying seconds passed while I watched, frozen in place. Bile rose in my throat, but fear and panic rooted me in place. The automaton straightened up, almost pleased at the outcome. Then it lumbered forward, analyzing the changed situation. Father remained prone on the ground. The twitching that had racked his body faded, the arm gradually dropped back down. The machine chuckled darkly, victorious. Chapter 15, Fight Like You Live. The machine took an almost lazy glance at me as it passed by, stopping right within reach. They say all animals have a flight or fight response. There's a third one that's not as catchy, freeze. Everything in me came to a complete stop from terror as I stared up at the monstrosity that loomed over. It could casually end my life if it so much as bothered to. A single swing of that arm would rip my jaw and head clean off my neck. That white skull-like faceplate with those horrifying violet-lit camera eyes alternated between me and Father's body a few times, contemplating a decision with no rush. It made a choice, turned and shambled towards its broken opponent in a slow, confident trot. If Father was still alive, that machine was clearly going to make absolutely sure that wasn't the case. I had been judged and found a non-threat. Out of time. I was out of time. Nothing was working. The jammed rifle dropped from my hands. I stuffed my free hand back into my glove and drew out my pistol. 10 shots were loaded inside, standard for scavengers. The oversized handle had been made for thick gloves. It wasn't made to be used by a terrified wielder. The pistol shook wildly in my hand as I lifted it into position, the tremors in my arm enough to ruin my accuracy. I couldn't take the shot like this. I also knew in the very core of my being, the moment I started firing, if I didn't destroy the thing within the first shot, it would turn and kill me. I had to make this hit count. No missing. I had to stop my god's damned shaking. The machine lumbered forward, step by step, unhurried. I took more breaths, trying to steady my arm. Just this one tiny thing needed to be done right. Aim and shoot. That's it. The gun still shook in my hands, my heart continued to beat like a mouse, and the chill of adrenaline was overwhelming my system. The creature bent over the motionless body of father, hand reaching out and delicately wrapping around his helmet, a massive palm obscuring the faceplate. Once it had a solid hold over the helmet, I heard metal groan as that hand started to squeeze. But the family armor held its shape. Either the armor was more durable than the creature had expected, or it was taking its time to slowly crush the relic armor. Father's body remained prone and limp the whole time. The pistol still shook wildly in my hands and nothing I could do was slowing that down. The gods flashed through my addled head. Tsuya was the goddess of tenacity, the paragon of resisting any opposition. Talon was of resolve, the willpower to commit to and stay any course. But Urs was the aspect of resilience. To overcome limitations from within. To overcome things of the living, like fear. It was his name that blazed through my mind, and cut like fire through my scattered thoughts. I whispered a prayer between my hyperventilating breaths, desperate for anything to steady my aim. Here was something I could focus on that didn't feel like the weight of the world was behind it. Just a few words under my breath. The shaking slowed. The weapon steadied in my hands. Father's helmet groaned and began to dent inwards where the thing's fingers were grasping, the creature's strength now exceeding the ancient metal. There was no time to wait for my hand to fully still. No other choice. I wasn't ready, but there was no such thing as ready, only ready enough. I pressed the trigger and prayed the shot would land. The cheap weapon barked in my hands, the sound piercing through the air. The bullet whizzed forward, tracer round showing its curving trajectory. It clipped the monster's chassis, dealing negligible damage and missing the back of its neck by a few inches. I fired again. The second shot hit a part of its arm and chipped off a ceramic chunk. The monster dodged the third shot as it twisted with an inhuman screech and sprinted towards me. The fourth shot went wild as panic ripped control from my senses with my own scream. I'd been trained hundreds of times on how to readjust my aim after missing. My sister could have managed this. But I wasn't my sister. I was just a worthless pretend scholar who had nothing to offer my clan other than scribbling numbers in the dirt. And now I'd die for it. There wasn't a fifth shot as the machine was already on top of me. It's odd how quickly the flip between fight, flight, and freeze could be turned. I dove out of the way, scrambling to my feet and bolting. My target was one of the machine corpses, the one with father's knife still embedded into its skull. If I could get that dagger, I might have a second chance against this thing. The machine clearly realized this. It chased behind, leaping above me and landing directly ahead, blocking the way forward. A massive hand swiped for me, catching me directly in the chest, knocking the breath out of my lungs and throwing me outright off my feet. Sensation and orientation vanished as I found myself rolling on the floor. Only halfway through standing up, my ankle twisted in pain as I was yanked up into the air, suspended upside down for a half second before being thrown. A wall stopped me, and it wasn't gentle about it. The warning alarm triggered from my speakers, screaming, adding even more confusion to my shaken and addled mind. The suit's backpack had taken the blunt damage. These systems were hardy, but they hadn't been made to resist being slammed into a wall like that. The padding inside my clothing had saved me both times, softening the blow just enough to not break bones, but the outside gear I wore didn't have any of that protection. I couldn't run from this thing. With those massive long legs, it could catch up to me within a few strides. That left only one option, to fight back. It trotted towards me, leisurely. Violet glowing eyes locked on my own, watching as I steadied myself back up. The machine had been strong enough to rip armor plates, lift me wholesale with one hand, and crush relic armor helmets. It's playing with me. It's clear it could rip my head off my neck at any time it wanted to, so maybe this was more like a cat playing with a mouse. I tried to aim and shoot the thing with my pistol again, only to realize that I'd dropped the weapon at some point after I'd been hit. My mind flashed through possible weapons I could use, warning alarm still ringing in my helmet. The only plan of action that came to mind was going to have to come with a miracle. I tore off the hood, earpiece, and rebreather, getting free of the obnoxious alarm in the most physical way possible. The air was cold, but the adrenaline damped everything now. The increased vision probably wouldn't do me any favors, but it certainly wouldn't reduce my chances. The machine stopped, watching as I fumbled to rid myself of gear. Its hands idly ripped gashes into the concrete floor, almost as if impatient for me to finish. I didn't need to be told twice, and moved as I could to take advantage of the spare time. I disconnected the heavy backpack, unhooked the pipes and cast them off. Dropping the thing on the ground freed up a lot of weight and also gave me a first view at the damages. Instantly I could tell getting back to the surface was going to require a spare system, mine had been crushed beyond fixing. Thoughts for later, gods above, if I could survive to worry about what comes after, I'd consider myself extremely lucky already. There were only a few tools that had survived through all of this. What I really needed was Father's knife, but the corpse into which it was embedded laid behind the machine, out of reach. The only other weapon left in my arsenal was almost fitting, really. I lifted my crowbar once again. The machine nodded, pleased I would give it at least some kind of fight. The weight and heft of my weapon calmed me. A glimmer of a chance came into light. The power of a crowbar wasn't something to mess with. If I could bash the head in before it could swipe my head off my shoulders, I might just make it. Father's rifle had killed these with a 3-round burst directly into that ceramic skull. They might not be as durable as they looked, I just needed something to even the odds so I'd get that chance. It wouldn't be a surprise if wildly swinging at the monster's head would not work. I'd need a backup plan for when it didn't. The creature clicked its claws in challenge and then charged forward. It howled for blood. I dropped my crowbar, then grabbed my detached backpack by the top handle. Inside were the broken-down environmental suits systems, junk metal now. But all I needed it for was its weight. I spun around, letting the centripetal force lift the backpack up. After one spin, I let it fly right into the approaching automaton. Instead of watching to see if it worked or not, I grabbed my discarded crowbar and charged behind my improvised throw. It hadn't gone perfectly straight at the thing's head, but it flew well enough to hinder the creature. The charge hadn't been paused, instead, the machine reached out with one hand and shoved the flying object out of the way with a slap. The backpack struck the ground again. If there had been any doubt that the system could have been repaired, the sound it made upon smashing into the ground confirmed it was dead and gone. I hadn't expected the throw to do much damage in the first place, so this was still going according to plan. The point was to make it pay attention to the sack of useless metal while I tried to get the first strike in. I lifted my crowbar and made a lunging attack the moment its head came into range. I saw it turn its attention away from the backpack and back to me. Realization passed through those eyes, I hadn't stayed put like good little terrified prey should have. Dodge this! My crowbar swung down through the air and struck an outstretched arm guard. Chips of ceramic armor broke off from the attack. It glared at me, safe from the crowbar by quick reflex. There wasn't time for a second attempt at distracting it. Its free hand shot out and hit me directly in the stomach. Vomit and bile came up as I tumbled on the ground this time. It had hit harder, knowing the padding protected me last time. The blow drowned me, my lungs unable to draw a breath back in. Pain finally cut through my adrenaline haze and blackness dragged my mind back and forth. Every bit of me was focused on getting air back into my lungs, coughing, wheezing. When my senses came back, I'd found myself sprawled on the floor, still trying to get more than a few whispers of breath. The crowbar had slipped from my hands at some point. Getting up was impossible, the best I could do was roll on all fours. Father's voice echoed in my mind when he'd explained how to spot their patrol paths. Machines are predictable. That swiping attack had been a mirror of the first attack it had thrown at me, only harder. Could I make use of that? I tried to buy myself more time, half crawling on the ground forward. If I knew the thing would swipe again the same way, was there a chance to? Its hand suddenly grabbed my ankle and reeled me backwards before I could finish thinking. My head hit the ground hard from the inertia change. The world turned in my sights, before I realized I had been flipped over on my back. The thing looked down at me almost curiously, head tilted to the side as it dragged me closer. The crowbar had landed only a few feet away, but far out of range now. I couldn't even see where my pistol had ended up, probably somewhere behind the creature too. Dreadfully long fingers reached down to my face. Before my groggy brain could come up with anything, those fingers had wrapped around my throat like a noose. I could feel the ice-cold metal pressed against my exposed skin. The hand constricted. Breathing gradually became a struggle as it squeezed little by little. It had me pinned down, holding me by the ankle and neck. I wasn't even strong enough to crawl away correctly, let alone fight back. Three gods above, I hadn't even gotten a full breath back after that hit to the gut, and now I was being strangled. Had I any shred of sanity left at that point, I might have laughed at just how terribly I'd messed up every single part of this. Everything would have gone differently if I'd had the simple presence of mind to take my fucking gloves off before reloading that rifle. It wouldn't have gotten jammed and I'd have been able to shoot the thing dead. This was it. I was going to die from one single mistake. Like an animal, desperation took control of my hands as I tried to pry the metal fingers off my throat. The machine's claw was utterly unyielding and my strength was like a toddler's in comparison. I could hear ragged breaths, my own, noisy and filled with panic. The vice grip tightened, slowly. Soon breathing stopped altogether and I couldn't draw even a fraction more. 3 weeks without food. 3 days without water. And 3 minutes without air. That was how long the average human could stay alive. My life was now measured in painful minutes, at the mercy of this thing. Instinct and terror suffused every single cell in my body. I kicked wildly without thought, but only one leg was free while the other was still held down by the creature's other hand. That did nothing to it, of course. I beat at the arm, clawed, and tried to pry it off again. My body twisted and twitched with wild abandon. The metal was laughably stronger than me. It could have crushed my throat then ripped my whole head clear off. It hadn't done that. It could have squeezed my arteries shut and had me pass out in seconds. It hadn't done that either. What it had done was cut off my breathing, without cutting off the jugular veins. That could only have been intentionally done. The skull-like faceplate inched closer and closer to me, as if fascinated by my struggles. I could see the small, glowing, violet cameras deep inside the bony eye sockets, staring me down. It felt like something was watching me through those lifeless eyes. It was watching me die as if I was a bug it had skewered, utterly enchanted. Something heavy landed on top of its spine with a thud. The creature's head spun around in surprise, only to collide against the barrel end of my lost pistol. Father stood on the monster's back, holding that weapon. He squeezed the trigger, point blank. Chapter 16, Pyrrhic Victory. The first point-blank shot ripped through the thing's head. The second shot ripped another hole as the creature shook. The third shot went wild as he slipped off the creature's chassis. While jumping off, 3 more shots rang out in quick succession, peppering the already battered head with expert precision. The gun clicked empty. Lights flickering to darkness, the machine slumped to the ground, finally dead. Father's feet landed back on the ground, the only one in the room still left standing somehow. He instantly rushed to my side next. The machine's hand on my ankle had slipped in the final blows, but it had locked the one around my throat in a dead man's hold, still preventing me from drawing a breath. Father was at my side, prying off the dead thing's fingers, one at a time with whatever strength was left in his relic armor. He worked without stopping, finding ways to pry the fingers with one hand. Darkness ebbed at the edge of my vision until enough fingers had been ripped off that I could draw a single ragged breath. Soon, hacking and coughing, I found myself somehow still alive. "Stabilize yourself," Father rasped out. He didn't wait to see if I had, instead stalked on an unsteady path to the body of the second automaton he'd partially destroyed earlier. One of the two he'd taken out with his rifle. The thing was still twitching, trying to get back up. I couldn't stop looking at it, violet lights flickering at the side while it struggled. Father paused on his way and turned a glance at me, then spoke out. "Listen to me, boy. Do you still have your kit?" he asked while struggling to reload the pistol with one hand. I looked at my belt and fished out a metal container at the side. It had a dent on the side but otherwise looked intact. I confirmed it to him. "You are in shock," he said. "You have a few hours before trauma settles permanently in your brain. Pick out the propranolol 7 and set it for quarter vials worth. It will block stress neurotransmitters on the amygdala. Do this right now." I glanced down at the pack, then hit the release tab and opened it without issue. A few different drugs and first aid kits were snugly bundled together next to the field repair gun. The padding had done its job, and the contents were all still in one piece despite the hits I'd taken. The appropriate marked vial was removed, twisted for a quarter dose, and then primed. I'd read about what this thing did. They weren't to be used lightly. I've had this metal vial for years now, sitting unused in the kit since the day I'd gotten them. Keith. Look around and describe every object in the room to yourself. Take a deep breath at each object. I don't care what you damn see, just, whatever you do, don't let your mind free until the propranolol hits your system. There was an urgency to his voice in this. I numbly put the syringe to my throat, then clicked the release. I felt a prick, but the adrenaline was still going strong in my system. The vial beeped, signaling it had delivered the payload. The movements were mechanical on my end. It seemed, now that everything was over, the training I'd done with my sister was finally kicking in. Shots rang out in the room and I looked up in time to see Father making sure that one automaton from the start of the fight had been completely destroyed. Job done, he holstered the gun and walked over unsteadily to the dead automaton his knife had ended up in. "You don't have time to waste," he growled out in anger. "Do as I ordered, or you'll be seeing this day again and again years from now, boy." I nodded, then took a deep breath of the ice-cold air. I could see the vapor leave my mouth, heat fading out. I took a breath. Father wrestled his knife out of the thing's head, then moved to the automaton's chest, cutting into it with the recovered weapon. I took a breath. The walls here were half metallic and half concrete, the gaps between both were stark and had no pattern that I could spot. It looked like metallic cancer with a geometric style. I took a breath. Father sheathed the knife back in his boots with that usual flourish. The knife slipped his grasp halfway and clinked to the floor. He stared at it for a moment, before reaching down and sheathing it plainly this time. His hand now free, he reached into the thing's mechanical guts, rifling through until he drew out a power cell. It was connected by a mass of black wires. I took a breath. The wires grew taut between the dead automaton and the heart he was pulling out. In moments, they snapped away, releasing the power cell with a jolt. Father pocketed it, moving to the next automaton to repeat the process, picking up his unspent grenade as he passed by it. We'd have a small stockpile of power cells after this. I took a breath. There were lights on the walls with some closer inspection, tiny, and without any pattern. Teal. The mites were still here, fixing up any damage that was caused by the fight, and almost pointedly ignoring everything else. I continued with the exercise, hyper-focusing on something, anything, and taking a deep breath in between. My mind grew fuzzy and then almost detached from the world. As if I was existing outside it but still controlling a fleshy avatar. It felt like such an odd thing to inhabit, so filled with chemicals and noise. Was this what I was? The sum of all my parts? Just flesh and chemicals in the end? It felt like I was something that existed separate from my body, only inhabiting it temporarily. I think it's kicked in. I feel disconnected, I said instead of pondering further. The dissociation will pass in a few more seconds. The neurotransmitters will remain blocked for a day or two depending on your system. You'll remember details from today, but they will feel abstract, as if they were someone else's memories. That's normal. And you? I'm moving forward on the assumption that I'll live through today. Frustration radiated from him, as if too many things were going wrong and he couldn't do anything about it. Your left arm, I said almost in a daze. It's not just injured, isn't it? Yes, he said after a moment of silence. The muscles were cut. He reached for his own kit and drew out a syringe of his own. It didn't look like the same thing I'd taken either. The fluid inside was a pale blue, and a warning sign was etched on the silver metal sides. This wasn't part of the normal kit. Something only relic wielders were allowed to use? What does that do? I asked him. He paused, glancing over me. It will trick my body into letting me move as if nothing was wrong with it and cut pain completely. If we make it back to the expedition in under a day, I'll be fine. I didn't ask what would happen if we didn't make it in time. I wasn't that stupid. The syringe primed, he stared at it, contemplating. Then he raised it to his neck and took a breath. His hand shook, holding the syringe at the ready. 1 breath. 2 breaths. Talon, guide me. He whispered, and with a jerk slammed the syringe against his suit until it beeped satisfactorily. Then he threw it aside, almost as if disgusted by the thing. It clinked hard on the ground, bouncing off and rolling away to join the rest of the detritus. Get up, he hissed. I wasn't sure if he was talking to me or himself at this point. We need to get moving, before more arrive. These things move in packs and quickly swarm any area that resists. The armor even groaned as he stood. Crackling sounds of electric failure lit up inside as the inner servos strained to move, but father pushed past and up, limping to his rifle. I could see more clearly those glowing lines under the plate. It reminded me of an occult knife glow, except it was clear these lines weren't for cutting. I'd heard there were a lot more occult items than just knives. Could these armors also have parts of the occult inside? That terminal, are you positive it will work if powered? Father said, cutting through my wandering mind. Terminal? The might terminal. Before we'd been ambushed. My mind felt fuzzy, but the details flowed back. I needed to make it back to that terminal, trace the power line to the switchboard, and then turn it on. And pray it would work. I'm not sure. I only think it does. It could go any direction. He grunted. We don't have another option. They're coming for us, we can't stumble around for another chance. It either works and we have a chance to live, or it doesn't and we die. He walked over to my cracked backpack and slung it over his shoulder, placing the pilfered power cells into it. Power cells are not our limiting resource now. Time is. He said. Get on my back, the suit can carry us both faster around the city. He walked over, and lifted me up with his free hand. I wrapped my hands around his neck to hold myself still on his back. My environmental suit's broken. I said. Even if we make it out, I can't go back top level. I'll freeze to death. He shook his head. There is still one way to get you to the surface. We can deal with that later, once we're out of danger. Terminal first. He began a brisk jog that would have been more of a sprint for my speed. The steps were unsteady, and his direction didn't follow a straight line. A few times he stumbled but continued forward. Soon we'd come back to where the dead terminal had been. The mites had already repaired my earlier slices. No trace of damage was left. How much time do we have until they come back? He grunted. Half hour at best. They're already on our trail at worst. But the armor would notify me if it had been pinged. We haven't yet been. There was still some time to escape. What's our plan? If the terminal works, we'll make use of it. After that, I'll carry you out. At my speed we'll be able to avoid patrols and slip out of their search radius. Underscore 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 un. A moment later, we had made it back to the switchboard, now knowing which one of the wires was ours from the hundreds that connected here. By then I was feeling a lot more lucid. Felt more like myself now. Everything before seemed like I had read it from one of my books rather than lived it. Gods above, it felt like everything had happened months ago even. Father's footsteps had also visibly improved, the stride returning to normal and no more stumbles. Whatever drug he took was doing its work. I was dropped off within the structure. Despite my mind feeling free of this whole ordeal, my body clearly reminded me it had all happened minutes ago. Father held my shoulder, and we both limped to the switchboard. Turning on that light was almost trivial. Oddly enough, the example light Father had asked earlier, before the fight, had been harder to turn on. The whole process took 3 switches on different sides of the board and turned a valve. The terminal wire lit up as predicted within seconds of me touching the whole contraption. I waited for a moment, thinking something inside this room would change, or a hidden door would open. Nothing of the like happened. The solution had been anticlimactic, but what had I really expected? The only way forward was to trust what I've done so far and check at the terminal itself. Again, he carried me back to the terminal, Father's relic armor reducing the time taken to mere minutes. When it came into sight, a crushing wave of utter defeat followed behind. The thing was still black and lifeless, even with the wire clearly powered on. All that for nothing. I chuckled. I guessed wrong. No. Father said, dropping me down and walking to the terminal. Then tapped on the black screen. Look. There, on the bottom right of the black screen, was a small line of white text. Complete with a text line divider, slowly blinking. Chapter 17, The Way Home. Node 7029/users/guest. The terminal was clearly expecting some sort of input. That explained why this piece of tech had a keyboard oddly attached to the side. I typed out hello, and pressed send. An answer came back immediately. Hello is not recognized as an internal or external command, operable program, or batch file. Ah! I'd seen terminals like this during my time hanging around the engineers of House Insight, usually from 3rd era tech. 4th era had smarter systems. Odd to see it in what I would have thought was lost tech built by mad mites. You were correct on the power issue. Father said at my side. Regrettably, this is a dead end. I've seen terminals with text twice so far and it ended up being more might madness. Wait, let me try some more with it. I could tell that annoyed him. We don't have time for this, boy. If it doesn't work, we're already dead anyhow. Might as well examine it to the end. Father stared me down, as if judging my worth. So be it, he sighed, taking the time to reload his weapon. Preparing already for the next fight. What are we looking to get from this? I asked. The terminal should contain a map. We need to find a way to download it into my armor. That's the objective. All right. If this was a command terminal, then help was a typical command that could let me figure out some more of this. I typed that out and pressed send. A massive list of possible commands was spat out onto the terminal screen in answer. Jackpot! Father studied the terminal over my shoulder. How did you do that? Do what? Have it reply like that instead of the error message. You need to ask it the right way. What were you doing before? We tried to type out our orders but it never seemed to understand past the first word we wrote. It doesn't speak English. The words might look English, but think of it more like another language which borrows English words. I've seen things like this before, it's a learned skill. He nodded. See about that map. There was a note of hope in his voice. Or I could have imagined that. The real search began for those commands that might get us that map. It felt straightforward to me so far. The syntax was different, but with enough experimentation I could figure out how to word the right requests. I'll keep watch, Father said as I worked. If they find us, give up on the terminal and start running immediately, and don't look back. I'll follow behind soon after. Are we clear? Crystal clear. I gulped. Underscore 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 un. There had been a mention of map and download in the list of commands and variables accessible, but I couldn't string them together without a syntax error. And there were a lot of those, of course. 12 times, in fact. But that's the normal process for any engineer worth their salt. Just had to keep trying again and again until I stumbled on the right way forward. Anari, I had equated it to slamming your head on a wall until the wall gave up. It was a lot of educated guesses, following hunches, and playing around with the basic help commands. A part deep inside me really wanted to play with the other commands on the terminal, to see what else this terminal could do. There were so many odd commands and functions in the list, a lot had no description whatsoever, which only made them more tantalizing. I'd need hours alone with this thing to really test everything out. Hours I didn't have. And then I hit a snag. The terminal froze when I executed my latest attempt. Button clicks no longer triggered, the whole thing didn't blink or move anymore. I must have hit a lockout, or there were only a number of commands that could be used. Okay. We're fucked. Father had noticed as well, the dented helmet glancing up at the exact same time the terminal froze. Accept download request, he said. But he hadn't been talking to me. The terminal unfroze the moment he'd finished voicing the command, and a progress bar now rapidly filled up on the screen. It worked. The might construct beeped happily, progress bar showing complete. Father lifted his right hand, palm up. A three-dimensional map appeared above, with a red triangle at the center. I gawked. Good work, he said, with a pitch to it I'd rarely heard before. We have a way home now. Was that map from the console? It looked like so much more than a map. Filled with lines and text, but it clearly correlated with our current location, with the red triangle in a scaled-down mirror of the room we were in. The scale of it alone felt massive. How large is this city? Miles in every direction, Father said. Each layer underground is a world on its own. No kidding. Rumor has it that there's 12 entire layers, each layer a mile high. Although nobody's gone deeper than 6 layers, so there could be more layers than the stories mentioned. Why the underground went a total of 12 miles below was anyone's guess. Assuming it really was 12 levels. Father wiggled his fingers, but the floating map on his palm did nothing in response. His helmet focused on it, Olish, muttering. Again his fingers moved, and again nothing happened above the map. He tried to slide his hand side to side, but the entire projection moved with it. Frustration built up with every attempt. Keith, I need your help. You need me to use my hand, don't you? It was pretty clear that one hand was supposed to hold the map, while the other controlled it. Father only had one hand to work with, his left remained limp at his side. We're looking for the outskirts of this city, he said. Controlling the map shouldn't be difficult, I'll help if you need it. Within a certain distance, the map instantly seemed to connect to my fingertips and began to do things based on their position. Opening my palms and moving them up seemed to zoom in the map, while closing it into a fist would disconnect the hand from the map. Panning my hand did exactly as I'd expected and panned the map. There was a limit to how far the projection could be drawn out, and the city was clearly larger than that limit. No help was needed at all from Father in the end, the controls were instantly intuitive. Eerily intuitive in fact. It seemed as if the map was outright guessing my intentions. Some of my motions were clumsy and inaccurate, but the effect I was looking for still happened. A pointed finger could do more than one action, and always seemed to do the one I'd been going for. An accidental swipe didn't wipe out my progress. A pinch did something different than the last time I'd pinched. Other small things started to add up. I only realized when I started focusing on those discrepancies. There had to be another intelligence of some kind helping out. Like a silent kitchen partner, handing me food ingredients and utensils without any prompting. Was this the relic armor's spirit? Some knights claimed the armor wasn't alive, that it ran on a complex but standard program. It spoke only to give reports or acknowledge commands according to them. A more popular rumor has it that these armors house the soul of the strongest warrior that died wielding them. Trapped inside, bound to eternal servitude. It was a chilling thought. But the occult was the only thing that could remotely be connected to something ethereal like a soul, and the warlock guilds kept their secrets tightly sealed. I think it's nonsense myself. If the warlock guilds had the keys to creating armor, they would have been doing that already. Instead, we're only getting trinkets from them. There, Father said, up north, to the right side. Do you see that tunnel? I zoomed on the area. It led to the very edge of the map. It doesn't show where it leads. That's out of this colony's territory, and they're the ones that made this map. It's to be expected they wouldn't have mapped it out. The edge of their cities lead to tunnels going to either the surface or a lower level. We'll be able to escape from there. The distance between the red triangle, I assume to be us, and the tunnel was massive. Plot chart. Father said. A line began to snake around the city, connecting our location to the tunnel. 7 miles as the airspeeder flies, but accounting for the turns and elevation, we'll need to traverse a total of 12 miles to make it. That should take us an hour to reach if I carried you the whole way. He snapped the map shut. We're on a time limit. Let's get moving. Underscore 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 un. The scale of the city didn't really draw on me until the moment we left the underbelly and entered the open space. Walking up a last set of stairs, into a massive plaza, the sight caught me dumbfounded. The ceiling stretched for what absolutely looked to be a mile above, one massive dome hanging over the entire city. It shouldn't be possible to hold that much weight from the surface without any pillars of support, but somehow the roof of the world stayed firm. It was when we traveled over the building rooftops that I got my first true view at the actual city itself. This place was a sprawling multi-leveled mess of buildings, nestled in what looked like a valley of mountains, which finally connected back to the surface. We were in a very lopsided crater, with that massive roof covering us where the surface would be. Sunlight leaked through thousands of cracks, illuminating the city under, even though it really shouldn't have to this degree. The city was massive, sprawling, and made little sense as I'd come to figure out. It never seemed to end, always winding in every direction. We'd sometimes have to crawl under pipes, or find the road to lead from rooftop to rooftop, climbing up and down stairs to find a better level of access. Mites held very little to be sacred, except for a path forward in some form. At one point, we even passed by the rooftop of a high 5-story building. That let me spot where we'd come from. The rubble of the frozen site was a massive distance away already, but parts of the site were still somewhat recognizable, jutting out in its disrepair against the clean walls and concrete of the city. A hole in the ceiling dome showed where the site had been on the surface. I don't understand how I survived that fall without any broken bones. It seemed completely impossible. I didn't get an answer either, at least none that I could think of. Father had grown stronger over the time since the fight. Whatever drug was in his system, he moved as if he'd had no issue. His left arm still couldn't, only gravity yanking it around, but everything else flowed like a well-oiled machine. How did you know how to fight them? The machines, I mean. I asked. For a few seconds he contemplated, as if he was picking the right words. When you fight a man, you can't know what to expect. Everyone fights differently, even though we are all human. Another leap, another landing, another sprint forward. Father still talked despite the speed he was pushing himself to. If you fight off a dog once, you know how all dogs fight. Animals don't learn how to fight in nature, it's ingrained in their species. The machines are like that, only smarter. All screamers will try to charge first and lunge for the throat the exact same way. They'll all try to strangle their targets if they can, and disembowel if they can't. They fixate on a target and pursue past the point of reason. And 100 other small quirks that they seem blind to. They'll adapt over the course of the fight almost immediately, but only after observing first. They never predict, they only react. Just how many of these have you fought? Enough to learn. All automatons have patterns, only not always obvious. Remember this if you ever get caught. There's always a weakness to leverage, Keith. Chapter 18, A Harsh Lesson to Learn. I remembered the last time I was carried in arm by the family armor. The clan had grown too cramped for our current habitat, but the scouts had discovered an empty fortress a few hundred miles away, far across the permafrost expanse. Maybe a month or two's worth of travel in the airspeeders, an expensive journey for the clan. Sometimes fortresses and habitats appeared, pushed from the underground. Sites that seemed almost tailor-made to withhold against the air and protect a population from the surface. Empty relic armors and weapons might even be found on the inside, assuming others hadn't stumbled upon it first. Our scouts had spotted one such fortress. This fortress had signs of having been lived in, perhaps another clan at some point. Brick buildings on the inside to separate halls, writing etched in walls, and other signs of a different people. That was the nature of things up here. We lived like hermit crabs, something the undersiders were quick to use as insults. Each time a clan grew too big, it would either find another home or fragment into smaller allied tribes. But splitting into smaller tribes came with dangers, and no one wanted to split if they could help it. That's why we'd be willing to live packed in tiny places that were made only to house hundreds, not thousands. But we could only stretch the infrastructure so far. Eventually, it was simple math that drove us out of our homes. Finding a new and larger fortress was a blessing from the gods, especially one that could hold thousands. This was a massive fortress habitat, and whichever clan had occupied it previously must have surely grown strong enough for a migration into the underground next, becoming a seedling city. They might have done so more than a decade ago. The clan spent a year preparing for our own migration to this new habitat. Most of the focus was on stocking food supplies for the long journey. Getting to know the local mechas, neighbors, and political situation that awaited us there. A small detachment of retainers to stake and hold our claim and reachers to slowly repair the construction back to its former glory. Years of neglect had allowed the frost to slowly infiltrate through the cracks and broken pipes. The engineers did not have an easy task ahead of them. The repair work for that alone was said to have been a brutal affair, costing the lives of several who'd hit on unlucky accidents while outside. Eventually, step by step, the fortress was brought back to life, and the clan ready for migration. All the alliances and new trade routes secured. We packed the non-combatants and other civilians into one massive expedition led by Lord Atius, and left our old habitat fortress for good, leaving it ready for the next clan to occupy. However many decades that could take. The journey was treacherous. Airspeeders would often break down after such extended uses, and salvage expeditions were sent out to recover the necessary scrap and materials to keep the convoy alive. You'd think it'd be during one of those small foraging expeditions that the raiders would attack, but they were after softer targets. Scrappers were hardy folk who didn't make good slaves. No, the real target was the civilians, the tradesmen, and children. the cooks, the servants, and the engineers. The people who couldn't fight back. And the only place to find those were among the main convoy, which would not make for an easy target. But months of travel was a long time, and they only needed a few minutes of weakness. The slavers must have been stalking quietly behind us for weeks, waiting for that inevitable chink in the armor. House Winterscar, House Eventide, and a smaller part of House Salvos had been trailing in the back of the convoy that day when the chink in the armor appeared. A blizzard wall hit. Visibility went down to nothing, while the airspeeders all continued somberly through the storm. Hours into the numbing blindness, the raiders picked their moment. The last few trailing airspeeders stalled and collapsed into the permafrost, their mass shoving away snow as they each skidded to a stop. The comms had gone down at the same time, mere seconds after our last check-in. The rest of the convoy continued forward, oblivious to the loss of comms. The storm covered the crime. And the conspirators within our midst covered the rest of the sabotage. They'd known how Salvos's 2 relic knights were in the airspeeder just slightly ahead, the airspeeder that conveniently hadn't been disabled, and continued forward, oblivious to the danger that had swallowed everyone behind. House Eventide was a Reacher-cast house, filled with engineers and civilians. They wouldn't offer up any resistance. And so the only danger to the raiders would come from House Winterscar. The plan had been calculated down to the details. Father could handle a fight against 2 other relic users at the same time, even drunk as he was that day. But the slavers had planned for that. They'd brought 4 relic armors among their numbers. I remember everyone frantically reaching for weapons, preparing for the fight. I was 13 back then, with a rifle shoved into my hands. A 10-year-old next to me was given a pistol. Whatever happened next, the raiders were not getting away without being bloodied. The airspeeder doors opened wide, and men charged out, improvised metal sheets as shields. They set up a quick trench line up ahead, digging the sheets of metal into the snow. The rest of us would file out once the bulwark was set up. Children too young or elderly would hunker down deeper into the airspeeder. Father staggered into our airspeeder a moment later, before Kedra and I were due to charge out. Drunk and tipsy as usual, but still lucid enough to function. The rest of the crew cried out for him to save them, begging in between the rifle shots and screaming in the background. He ignored all of them, shoving through like a sledgehammer against concrete. Someone's jaw was broken as he swept people away. His armored boot stomped over a terrified boy's leg and crushed it. I could see the suit tear open, the blood instantly freezing. Then his hand reached for both my sister and I, lifting us out of the airspeeder. And then he ran. Ran right past the disabled airspeeders of House Eventide, which we were sworn to protect. Ran away as the rest of the infamous Winterscars stood their ground to protect the Reachers. Ran away with just my sister and I clutched to his sides. He didn't say a word, only the sounds of his straining breaths in our comms. The family armor made his sprint something utterly inhuman. In seconds the howling snow was all we could see as the blizzard wall hid everything. Father still ran, completely blind. Whatever he'd drunk threatened to trip him multiple times. He held on. Airspeeders were quick, but the speed was still set deliberately slow. A lot of Reachers had calculated exactly what the optimal speed to fuel-to-food ratio could be used. The result was a fast airspeeder, just not quite as fast as a harrowed-out relic knight with a purpose. Father made it to House Salvos's functioning airspeeder, appearing out of the blizzard like a ghost. It had been about 15 minutes at his full sprint. The scavengers that dotted the ship's hull all glanced at the sudden appearance of a relic user from the wall of the snowstorm. Then they frantically pointed at him once they realized this shouldn't be happening at all. The speeder immediately slowed to a stop as Father leapt into the open interior compartment, dropping both of us inside. "What's the meaning of this, Winterscar? Run out of booze." A voice came from within. One of the relic knights from House Salvos walked into view. Father told them. Only one single word, but instantly the entire convoy took action. Slavers. In seconds, the airspeeder had turned and shot off at full breakneck speed. Some of House Salvos's scavengers on the hull seats would have been thrown off the ship if the comms wide warning hadn't sounded off. The pilot's rage could be felt through her voice with such clarity even I reflexively clutched to anything in range, though I was safe on the interior. The rest of the convoy was close on our heels following the comms chatter, including a furious Deathless. The raiders had brought 4 relic wielders to counter Father, but they'd stand absolutely no chance against the powers Lord Atius wielded. In mere minutes the speeder crossed the distance Father had sprinted through, a fraction of the time it took him. It hadn't been enough. What we found wasn't a fight, but the end of one. Only a few members of House Salvos's were left shooting from their downed airspeeder while the raiders had completely emptied the 4 others that dotted the landscape. Behind them, a huddle of reachers from Eventide had managed to run out of their doomed speeders to safety. House Winterscar was gone, save for the bodies that were quickly getting buried in snow, their airspeeders among the claimed ground. They'd all been either taken, or killed while buying those reachers time to fall back. Ironic that at the very end, in the face of death, the House Winterscar had honored their oaths. They'd heard the call and stood their ground. All except for Father. The raiders were mere minutes away from claiming the last airspeeder and seizing the whole of House Eventide, until they saw the incoming cavalry. They instantly turned and ran. A few unlucky raiders were gunned down from a distance, but most managed to flee into the underground cracks, executing or dragging down whatever prey was left in arm's reach. Soon we were left with nothing but dead bodies in the snow. The airspeeders had been damaged in the fight. It would take hours to repair them. Our entire route and plan had to be recalculated from scratch. But the clan would continue forward, 1 house less. We couldn't chase them underground, we hadn't prepared for an expedition of that scale. There was no other choice but to leave. Lord Atius executed 3 men that week, after sniffing out the treachery. When he led a team to the base of operations he'd extracted from the traders, he only found an empty staging ground. The slavers were long gone. Everyone said Father had made the only logical choice. To fight off 4 relic knights was to guarantee death, and worse, his armor would absolutely be stolen. They'd kill Father, carry his dead body away and be glad to trade any amount of potential slaves for it. If he'd not warned the convoy, they'd never have returned in the first place until the snowstorm ended. I'm not sure that's what had gone through his mind at all. What I am sure of is that he never touched another bottle after that day. The entire migration, he spent the rest of it on a sickbed. A month of fevers, shaking and delirium as he refused anything besides water. And once he paid off his dues to his former addiction, he stepped out of that bed and started training the 2 of us night and day like there was a deadline to keep. It was miserable, grueling, filled with blood and bruises. 9 goddamn years of that. Father was a savant when it came to combat. Only Kidra seemed to intuitively understand his lessons. Each lesson would start like training and eventually devolve to a beatdown as he grew frustrated at being unable to teach me as quickly as my sister. Broken bones, black eyes, screaming, it felt like he was so desperate to make sure I knew at least something about how to fight at his level, and now I understood why. But I wouldn't ever be as good as my sister. She was favored by Tsuya, and I simply wasn't good at fighting. I thought back on the automaton, how I'd still failed every lesson, every drill, all those years of training. I still froze up like a coward when the moment came to make use of it all. I'd been prepared to fight against other humans or any of the typical dangers above on the surface. Somehow, that single automaton scared me more than any raider ever could. Why was I saved from that raid if this was how it was going to end up? I'd asked myself that question time and time again, but this time it really struck home. There were so many others he could have picked up and carried to safety, men and women of amazing talent, but only my sister and I were picked. She was worthy of it at least. I absolutely wasn't. And now he carried me once again, this time deep underground. He should just drop me and leave. It would be easy. There were hundreds of excuses. Say I'd been killed by an automaton, or that the fall snapped my neck. Father remained silent, giving no answer to my unasked questions. We were swiftly approaching the next rooftop, he'd need to jump soon. The old armor flexed under his control, alive in a way I hadn't been able to appreciate back when I was 13. But gripping on his back, I'd gotten a much closer look at that armor in the last hour than I'd had in the last few years put together. It was amazing how it showed no hint of the combat damage sustained an hour before. The spirit of the armor had fixed it all. The only cost was time, 2 power cells and the leftovers of my environmental suit system, cannibalized for the greater good. With our haul of power cells, Father's body was the weak link that would give out first. There was no point to hoarding the suit's energy. The legs bent, power thrumming through, and he sailed forward through the air, landing with a heavy crack across the gap. The first few times had terrified me, but I'd gotten the hang of it by now. Maybe having nothing to do other than hold onto his back had given me some introspective time to sort out what had happened. I still had the bruises on my throat as a reminder. And the shame. Mostly the shame. Underscore 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 un. At our speed we were approaching the end of the Mites map and would reach the outskirts within 10 minutes or less. We'd have to figure out where to go from there. I was hoping our luck would hold when it came to the machines, but of course, that wasn't going to be the case. We've been spotted. Father said over comms. One of their patrol paths. No, they've sent another hunter after me. It's caught up. I saw it from the corner of my eye at first. A single violet-white machine. It looked very different from the previous ones. A long segmented snake-like body, 4 legs and massive spine blades jutting across the links. Like a skeletal lizard. It jumped over roofs like we were, barreling down with single-minded intent. The clan habitat had its own micro-ecosystem of creatures, one of which was a predatory lizard that hunted down insects and roaches that lurked inside the pipe system. Those tiny lizards had crushing jaws and faster strikes. The maw of this thing looked like a giant cousin of those pipe lizards, filled with artificial teeth that I could see in detail even from this distance. And like the previous automaton, violet lights and white ceramic armor with a skull-like face. An inhuman elongated skull this time. I'd watched unsuspecting insects get chased down in a flash and swallowed up, attacked from the dark reaches those insects had thought safe. Now, we were the insects. Chapter 19, Maw of the Drake. Father, of course, was aware of the danger. He'd simply glanced back at the incoming threat, then changed course slightly. I thought we'd be able to outrun it, but Father had clearly calculated that wasn't the case. It was gaining on us from what I could tell. The creature moving faster than even relic armor was capable of. He said machines all had weakness, but that also implied they had strong points too. Hold tight, I'll need to dodge for this. Don't get in my way. Father said in between breaths. His hand stopped supporting my weight, getting ready. The creature opened its mouth, and a violet glow lined the jaws. Father didn't wait for confirmation, instead making one low leap on reaching the end of a roof. He hooked his hand to the railing, killing his forward momentum and swinging violently down into the alleyways below. The move almost threw me off by sheer centrifugal force, but I'd held through somehow. Above us, a bright violet beam shot through the air where we'd been a moment ago. The laser was blinding, remaining like a yellow-gold ghost across my vision, even after I looked away. Father landed with a thud, then sprinted down a few blocks. What was that? I yelled out, struggling to hold on. A drake. They're stronger than screamers, but they avoid close combat if they can. Those beams can cut anything for them, even shielded relic armor, so they rely on that first. They have powerful long-distance sight to pair with the beam, but that advantage cuts both ways. It's most vulnerable for a counterattack after it fires. The next instant, he leapt to the side into an empty pseudo-house. Dust filled the inside, along with a table and chair set, all made of concrete. Table, chair, and all. Get behind something and stay still as a grave, boy. Don't draw your weapon, stay still and trust me. A table and chairs didn't make for the best hiding spot, but beggars can't be choosers. I scrambled over and ducked, finding a good enough spot that covered most of me in the shadow. Father hugged the wall by the door, flipping his knife out and leaving it off. He remained completely frozen, waiting. I heard a resounding thud as something heavy dropped into the same alleyway we'd ended up in. The automaton had followed us. Now to see which direction it would go. I could hear footsteps outside, slow and meticulous. Hunting. Slow minutes crawled by as it continued to rifle through the nearby houses. I felt it turn and examine a house further from us. I thought I could even hear voices, or one single deeper voice. But it was too far away to really tell if I was just jumping at shadows. It had picked the wrong direction to go down from the sounds. Hope was quickly crushed underfoot, by Father himself. He turned the knife on, sliced off a small chunk of the doorway and kicked it outside. It hit a wall, loudly. The blue glow in our room winked out of view as he turned the knife off. Heavy footfalls grew in our direction almost immediately after. I shot him a horrified glance, quickly signaling confusion. He tried to return a signal, but with the knife in hand, he couldn't articulate the fingers well enough to communicate anything. So he shook his head silently instead, and returned to position. The heavy footsteps came closer. Soon, I caught glimpses of the creature's body through the empty window frame of our hiding spot. It walked on 4 legs, head shaking from right to left with each step. I curled further down, hoping it hadn't seen me in the brief moment I'd seen it. Then I heard it. "Come, little human." It was a heavy, low rumble that seemed to rattle in my head even after the words left. "SSSSSS, there, lurking under your skin, is an infestation. It beats in your heart, spreading disease with every gasp. I want to clean you of it." Insanity left its mouth with each word floating through the cold air. It spoke like nothing I had ever known. The words individually made sense, but the whole just seemed too alien. Like these words were never meant to be put together in such an order. Its pitch and timbre felt like coals raking through my mind. It drew closer to our house. Father stayed where he was, flat against the wall. "SSSSSSS. Such a pristine violation of flesh, whispering lies in your head from 1,000 tongues. I'll bring you salvation. From that, rot. From that grotesque tumor cradled in soft tissue and bone, laying deep within." I couldn't help but take glances through the window as it moved across the street from us. The size of its body was massive. It couldn't possibly fit through any of these doorways, and it didn't. Instead, it slithered its head into each, searching for us. Pace was slow and measured, no caution in the steps, only conviction. "SSSSSSS. Come out, little human. You poor suffering child. Let me touch the marrow inside your bones. Let me take you away. I'll be your refuge. Your shelter from suffering. I'll clean your soul and skull of torment and depravity." The massive head trotted outside our doorway. It paused, then slowly turned to peek inside, the violet eyes scanning through the building I hid in. Dried blood speckled the almost pristine white fangs of the creature. The jaw seemed to be stretched in a perpetual smile. I broke my gaze and hid further under the table, but somehow I knew deep inside that the thing had spotted me. I took a panicked look up again, only to catch its eyes staring right back. It leaned closer to the house. "I see you, cowering in the darkness, so afraid of the light. Venerate this moment. She has sent me to free you, of this agony you live in." It spoke, head snaking slowly into the house, filling up the doorway and passing by it, inch by inch. Thoughts raced through my head, lucid and unobstructed. This close, I could probably shoot the thing without missing. My fingers twitched to grab my pistol, but father's warning rang through my head. To trust him. To not draw a weapon. There wasn't much time to say anything else. My instincts warred with my logic. Father remained unmoving at the doorway, as the machine head creeped by mere inches away. The drake didn't seem to spot him, its eyes focused intently on me. How had it not seen father? They have powerful long-distance sight to pair with the beam, but that advantage cuts both ways. Field of view. It hadn't missed father by accident. It hadn't been able to see him at that angle, the vision too narrow. Then my part in all this was to be bait. That's why he didn't want me to move or fight back. I'd lure the thing into believing it had already won. I closed my eyes, and focused on remaining still. My world turned to blackness with only sounds left to paint the world with. Yes, yes, close your eyes. I bring you, what you've been searching for. The silence you so desperately crave. A sound of something humming, electricity charging up. Snap hiss of father's dagger being turned on. Impact and metal melting. Energy and lightning screaming past me. Heat. Heat that I could feel at the side of my exposed cheeks. I ripped my eyes open again. The table in front of me had a hole melted into it. The beam that had caused the damage narrowly missed me, cutting into the wall behind. It must have tried to fire at me. And missed. Father stood resolute, his knife embedded deep into the automaton's head. Superheated drafts blurred the frozen air, a massive haze steaming from the maw. It struggled to turn, but the movements were overpowered by the ancient gauntlet, holding that knife. The drake hadn't missed by accident, it had been forced to miss. The thing seemed almost shocked at being caught flat-handed like this. Father cut the weapon down and twisted the knife violently in a fluid motion. The head fell limp onto the ground, critical metal muscles and tendons severed off. The body behind followed suit, slumping with a heavy thud, dust spilling into the air as it collapsed. Only the eyes moved, turning to focus on its killer, the camera iris narrowing with hate. It spoke as father re-griped his knife to execute a different cut. "SSSSSS, you. Enough," father said and cut down. The knife glided across its neck with ease, splitting through the rest of the cables with expert direction. The violet lights turned off, and there was only silence again. Chapter 20, They Can Talk? They can talk? I asked, picking myself off the floor. The left side of my environmental suit was blackened slightly, the shoulders blood-red insignia of House Winterscar still legible however. Barely. I'd have worried about weave integrity from something like that, except I had bigger icicles to worry about. A lot bigger. Father's hand whipped the knife back out of the creature's neck, shutting it off and flicking it back into his boot with his usual flourish. A fool can talk. That doesn't mean he says anything. But can we actually communicate with the automatons? I asked, maybe we can find out why they hate us so much? Or where they come from in the first place? He shrugged in response, walking to the empty window frame. The songs of faith imply that the machines came from oblivion, deep in the space beyond the world. The gods are holding the worst of them from reaching Earth, but the ones already here, that is our duty to keep in check. I know what the songs say, but those come from our clerics. I mean, what do the automatons themselves say? No one knows. Again he shrugged, climbing out the open windowsill. Not all of them talk either. There isn't a single person that tried to capture one. That seemed odd. Was there a technical issue in the way? Maybe some have. If they learned anything important, they kept it to themselves. I couldn't have been the first person to ask this question, so why hadn't a word about this make it up to the surface? The only way this made sense to me is if they somehow evaded capture. Which was impossible in the long run. There had been a war with these machines for centuries. Unless... do they explode if they're captured? Or shut themselves down? Father didn't give an answer, waiting for me to pass over the barrier. He had used the open window, so I followed suit. Without the bulky suit heating systems, I was light on my feet. Pulling myself through was easy enough. We've never tried to capture one of these things while down here. Father said. If they explode or turn themselves off during capture, I couldn't answer you. I've never seen the small ones explode before either. They're usually killed off quickly at range. Considering it took only a well-placed round of bullets in their skulls to take them down, I could understand what Father explained. They seemed more specialized at hunting down lone or separated targets. Surely machines could create more optimized weapons. It seemed like terrifying people was their primary objective over being competent at killing. The thing had toyed with me even. Outside I could really see the scale of the Drake. It was massive, even dead on the street it towered over me. To think it had been killed in a matter of seconds, by a crippled man no less. What makes these things tick? It said someone had sent it. Who? Keith. Enough. Those questions don't have any answers, we need to leave. Now. He motioned me to climb on his back. Seems like we were ignoring the possible salvage opportunity from the Drake. Understandable, since other machines would be coming here soon. A part of me balked at that. It certainly felt like a waste to at least not nick something from all this. But I could recognize we had enough power cells in my pack and time was more premium than another one. He picked back up at a breakneck pace, jumping back onto the roofs to get a clear line of sight to our goal. Can math theories be disproved? He asked a few minutes into the journey. I immediately knew that question was bait. It couldn't have been more obvious bait than if it had been a steel trap with a ration bar waiting over it. But bait wasn't bait unless it was tempting. I bit. Yes? Where are you going with this? Can you disprove that 2 and 2 make 4? No, I wasn't quite sure what else to say about that. It's not likely that sort of basic building block could get disproved anytime soon. Automatons are the same, he said. They're programmed to kill us. Anything they say might as well have no correlation to their actions. Well, that doesn't mean it can't ever be disproved in the future. People in the Third Era thought magic didn't exist. I pointed at his knife. And look, today we have the deathless and the occult arts. Someone must have discovered it by asking questions on things everyone else assumed was fact. He groaned in frustration, audible even over his running steps. I'm trying to talk to you in a way you might understand, boy. These things, they can't be reasoned with. They simply can't. You'll only give them an easier time killing you. I decided not to press the issue. I didn't agree with him, but I could understand his point of view. Underscore 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 un. The first sign we had that we'd come near the end of this city was the lack of teal glimmering lights. The mites simply didn't appear anymore. It gave the surrounding environment an eerie, lonely feeling. There were no people, no voices, no sounds besides that of Father's tireless sprint forward. The buildings here soon showed signs of disuse and destruction. Gouges on the sides of the walls remained unrepaired. Roofs collapsed. Walls broke down, and even the city lights were occasionally swallowed up by darkness. The only thing that remained undamaged was the light from above. It flowed from the surface, through the cracks in the impossibly huge roof of this city. We'd reached the mountain base, buildings became more sparse and rocky uneven, ground started to come into vogue. Chasms leading further down into the underground appeared, but if they truly led to the level under us or just a dead end, I'd never know. It was really something to realize maybe a few dozen meters under our feet was the ceiling to a whole other world, the second layer down. How any of it didn't collapse was probably something only the gods would know. We weren't halfway up before I heard distant shrieking. Father instantly bolted behind a rock, grabbed me off his shoulder and dumped me into one of the crevices. It was a tight fit, but I was completely obscured from view at least. Stay out of sight, he hissed, staying up on the surface. A pack of screamers in the distance, likely searching around the machine I killed. They have poor long-distance eyesights unlike drakes. We should be able to hide from their patrol. The automatons in the distance howled, moaned and screamed fury. I couldn't tell if they were getting closer or further. Father brought out his rifle, muttering under his helmet. I brought out my own pistol, freshly reloaded and ready. This time I swore to myself I would do better than the first time we'd had to fight screamers. Minutes passed by in the tense silence. The sounds faded away, replaced by relief. We're clear. Father confirmed, breathing out a held breath. They didn't catch sight of us. I breathed out slowly myself, muttering and climbing back out. How does anyone manage to live down here? They'd be attacked day and night at this rate. The Undersiders would have all gone extinct a long time ago if they had to constantly keep vigil against all sides. Even with their armors. No, they have some kind of repellent shield to protect their cities. Father said, lifting me the rest of the way out. Some kind of new lost tech. I never learned the details on what they used to protect their cities. They'd never let us surface dwellers anywhere deeper into their cities. Only the trade market zones allowed us entry. Right, of course they wouldn't let savages like us learn how to live underground. I sighed. It's not a perfect solution. It doesn't work forever. They need to fight off waves of attacks during the times their shields go down. He stretched out his hand, making the hand sign for thirst. Have reserve water. A check in my suit showed I still had a good amount left. I took a big sip for myself and then unhooked the flask from the inside of my suit and passed it over. He sat down and leaned back against the rock with a groan, unclipping his armor's water flask. He transferred over my flask's contents to his own. Neither relic wielders or scavengers could take our headwear off to drink on the surface for obvious reasons, so it was integrated into the suit, closer to our bodies in order to remain unfrozen. Normally, I'd be drinking from a straw, if I still had any of my headgear. When he handed back the canteen, it was half empty but still had some reserves left. Should we keep moving? I asked. Best be sure they're all gone, stragglers included. Eat something in the meantime. I brought out my rations, dried frost bloom wrapped around flash frozen printed meat, with a few sweet spices and salt to mask most of the bitter taste frost bloom was notorious for. One stick could be a full meal. Not the tastiest, but easy enough to eat. Can't argue with the results, that little miracle we'd had everything needed by a human diet. Designed by the gods some say, since it seemed extremely unlikely that anything could survive on the surface, and also conveniently be able to sustain the human population indefinitely. Someone was looking out for us. I had no idea when I'd be able to eat another meal, so good or bad, I'm filling up. We'd been down here for just about half a day now, maybe a few hours more. This would let me keep going for another day. Father crossed his legs and fell into meditation, likely reviewing the past fights in his mind to see what could be learned. I did the same, but instead considered the automatons and what people believed they'd originate from. There were hundreds of sub-religions, each having their own unique take on that question, but none as popular as the big three. The Imperials believed the machines had been created by the violet goddess from deep in the heart of the world, to be her foot soldiers. At some point in the distant future, some massive apocalyptic war will break out, and that evil goddess was preparing for it. The Imperials saw it as their duty to prepare their own army, so that when their sun goddess appeared to lead the fight, they would join ranks with her. Which made them the only religion with a heavily organized military structure. I'd never met Puritans, but I'd read about them. They believed that the world had been one giant metallic mine that got split into fragments. The good fragments of the mine found a way to cast away all metal and become living beings. The automatons, naturally, were all the evil parts that chose to stay tainted with metal. So to them, we were even related on some level. As for us Exodosites, the songs weren't exactly subtle in their messaging about outer space. The problem is that all three possible explanations were completely different from one another. Exodosites believed the automatons come from the darkness between the stars, and more of them could appear if our gods in their orbiting fortresses weren't holding them back. Imperials believed automatons had been created here in the heart of the world by a malignant force that wants us all dead. And Puritans believed we were all part of the same mind at one point, and machines were all of our evil castaway thoughts cranked up to 11, so technically we created the machines. Which one was right? I really wanted to hear something more evidence-based, to hear from the automatons themselves. But for all I knew, they might have conflicting religions of their own. If machines even worshipped gods in the first place? That Drake had said someone had sent it. So who had enough pull to command machines? An Imperial would instantly say it was the Violet Goddess, but it really could be anything. Or just noise, like Father suggested. So far the Imperials seemed like they had something right, with the machines having a violet coloring. If those Drakes were repeating the same lines to anyone they attacked, it would make sense this sort of conclusion could slowly coalesce into a religion. I mulled over what I knew, but there was nothing else I could squeeze. Having exhausted that possible source of information, I turned to the other side of the coin. If there wasn't anything else to learn about the machines, perhaps there could be something to learn about their ancient enemies. And there was someone who might know more. Can you tell me more about the Deathless? Father glanced at me, breaking out of his meditation. No doubt you guessed by now that the conflicting rumors are intentional? I expect a convincing argument on why I should share. I'd expected this. Not everything about them is going to be a kept secret. We know they can live forever, and stand on the surface of the world, for example. Is there anything else that you can tell me about them that isn't an operational secret? We're underground already. If you wanted me to be in the dark about this part of the world, the snow's already in the suit. Father stayed silent for a moment, likely picking out how to answer. Everyone tunnel visions on their powers, but not on the patterns around them. There are generations of Deathless. Different powers, different ways they've appeared, different drawbacks they have. Each generation seems to build on the previous successful iteration. Lord Atius is among the older generation. I've heard a lot of conflicting rumors, but this one's new. Generations of Deathless? Iterations? I can see how that contributes to all the confusion about them. He nodded. Something they've leaned into. The Deathless themselves know very little about their own origins. One of the unifying factors across all the generations is that they've all lost their memory. I'd heard that rumor too, though hadn't put a lot of stock into it. They lose their memories every 100 years. No. As far as Lord Atius knows, only one generation loses their memories each century. The rest lost memories the day they gained their powers. How much do they lose? All of it. There are no Deathless that remember who they were before they gained their title and powers. Some sort of experiment happening underground? And the Deathless are the experiment subjects, tossed out into the wild or something. You have such a strange imagination, boy. That's the first thing that goes through your mind. He shook his head. No. The earliest memory Lord Atius had was opening his eyes into an empty room with a written note, in his handwriting, asking him to save a village. No lab, or experiment. He suspects he'd stumbled on something, while he had been human. There's more to it, but that's all I would expect the public could know about. And all I can tell you. That was a lot to unpack. If Atius's previous self had the time to both write that note, and direct it, that meant he'd known what was coming. It could have been a choice to become a Deathless. If he'd been forced into it, he might have mentioned that in the letter. And if it had caught him by surprise, there wouldn't have been a message in the first place. I'm guessing he succeeded in protecting that village. For about 100 years he did. But it grew too dangerous, so he led that city up to the surface. Oh. The clan. He nodded. That is part of the clan history. He doesn't go out of his way to point out he'd lost his memory, although he won't hide the fact either. You could consider it an open secret. All right. So the deathless have generations, each building on the previous ones, similar to evolution? Makes a lot more sense now why there's so many different stories about the lot. Memory played some kind of factor that couldn't be avoided for any of them. Though there was one generation that had it worse in that regard. Why is Atius not down here, fighting off the machines? At that, Father shrugged. That is one question I do not have an answer. I suppose he is up here because he wishes to be. Perhaps the gods did not only choose the greatest warriors to become deathless, but they've also seen fit to choose wise leaders as well. I'm starting to see a macro pattern here. The surface clans had a renewable source of energy from the celestial flyovers, renewable food from frost bloom, structures that appeared pushed up from the underground built to protect a population, and empowered immortal heroes picked from the best humanity had to offer, to lead the clans. All added together, it pointed that someone powerful had a vested interest in keeping the surface dwellers alive. The obvious answer was the gods. Only they could have such a reach. I wondered what gifts they bestowed on those who lived underground. It's unknown why the deathless seem compelled to fight the machines, or protect humanity. Father said. Lord Atius has a theory that only a paragon would choose to give up all memory in exchange for power. Such a trade is akin to death, or to surrender your body to another soul. He believes that the person's nature remains even if their memories do not. Well, I said, chewing on my ration. If I were a god in charge of picking people that'll stay around for eternity, I'd pick the best humanity had to offer, that's for sure. People like Kedra would have been who'd I'd elevate to deathless status, were it me picking. Were it only like that forever? Father said, a note of trouble in his voice. What do you mean by that? I doubt we will run into any, and I hesitate to tell you this. However, you might need to know what to expect. And it's only a matter of time until you learn about it. He nodded, almost as if trying to convince himself. The new generation appearing, as of a year ago, are unhinged. Gods above. Unhinged deathless? Machines were already an impossible feat to overcome completely, but immortal demigods with paranormal abilities turning against humanity? By unhinged, what exactly do you mean? Are they attacking the Undersiders? They're still hostile to the machines and fight any they meet, but they have also been known to attack civilians. They fight among each other mostly. For weapons, armor, trophies, or simply the thrill of it. Lord Atius and all the previous deathless don't understand these new ones. We don't know much about the situation down here, only small bits and pieces of rumor are added each time we dive down for a mission. Deathless are rare, it's common knowledge that each year, perhaps 5 more appeared, in the whole world. 5 unhinged demigods could be contained by the other deathless working together. However, you make it sound like there's hundreds of them running around. Not in the hundreds. Father said. In the 100,000s. I froze. An entire army of them stomping around the world? He continued the strange news. Already more deathless of this generation have appeared, than all the previous ones put together. Twice over perhaps. All in this single year. How are the Undersiders handling it? Not well. Before, deathless were heroes who were welcome with open arms by their very nature. Now, cities keep a closer watch on them than they would a passing surface dweller like myself. That must be a lot of scrutiny. The Undersiders hated the surface clans. The only ones who had friendly relationships with us were the more recent clans who'd settled back down and hadn't yet lost their surface culture. And the Imperial Pilgrims. Which makes sense since Imperials worship the sun goddess. And the sun is visible only in one place. We quite treasured the pilgrims when they did come up. They'd offer us food and tech, and in exchange we would supply them with the best gear, guides and protection they needed to successfully go out into the surface. I might be underselling just how much pilgrims are treasured in our culture, entire blood feuds between clans or great houses were put on hold anytime the pilgrims were around. Wait. Talking about the pilgrims, how are the Imperials handling it? An army of deathless appearing would be alarm bells for the great war of theirs. Not well either. He sighed. Many see this as the sign of the end times, as you'd expect. Most don't know what to think about this new iteration. They used to be seen as the messengers of their sun goddess. Now, nobody quite knows what the future holds. The world is changing, that much is certain. He stood up, signaling the break was coming to an end. Lord Atius had ordered information about this be kept secret. He wanted to see how events would play out first. However, he knew it was only a matter of time until the next pilgrims arrived up and shared the news. You would have found out soon enough. Rifle left hanging on his strap, he motioned me over. That's enough time spent for now. We need to be moving. I settled in position on his back, and he took off again up the slope. We'd soon arrive at the tunnels, and leave this endless, multi-layered city. I prayed it would be safer in these caves. I prayed these new deathless were still friends with humanity in general. But most of all, I prayed the gods were watching over us right now.